Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. In his Hellenica, Xenophon of Athens gave his version of the events of the half-century that had just passed when he wrote it, the years between 411 and 362 BC. That was a dramatic period in the history of Greece, in which the fortunes of the leading Greek city-states rose and fell disconcertingly as they repeatedly fought one another in shifting combinations. It was also a period that was vital in the development of our own culture. The citizens of Athens overcame problems in reconciling law and popular government, and so produced a stable democracy. Much of what was written then continues to inspire philosophers and historians today. The Hellenica largely concentrates on the relations between the two leading Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta, which were at war with each other for about half of this period, but were allies at its end. Xenophon had been a young man in Athens in the 400s, served in the Spartan army in early middle age, and later lived as a dependent of Sparta, so he knew what he was writing about. He finished the work only about 5 years or so after 362, when his narrative ends, and had in mind an audience that also knew a great deal about his subject matter, a fact that can create difficulties for the modern reader. Xenophon intended to tell his readers some new things, but he mostly aimed to give them his own slant on what was for them a familiar story. He wanted to make clear the messages he thought he found in the recent past. At the same time, he was almost as much concerned to make the past live again for his audience. What had happened before? Well, the very first sentence of the Hellenica presupposes knowledge that the first readers all had, but that is not so familiar today. It starts disconcertingly with the Greek words metadetauta, or after these things. The reader is evidently expected to know what happened earlier. At the Hellenica's opening in 411, the Athenians are fighting the Spartans, with the Persians intermittently supporting the latter. The story of the shifting relationships of these three powers had been a large part of the history of Greece throughout the 5th century, and it was to continue to be throughout the period that Xenophon covers. In 480 BC, the great king of Persia, Xerxes, had mounted a huge expedition against continental Greece. Then, as later, Sparta and Athens were the two most powerful military city-states in Greece, the Spartans on land and through the system of alliances by which they controlled almost all of the Peloponnese, and the Athenians at sea through their fleet, the largest of any Greek city-state. The two cities stood together against the Persians, and many of the other Greeks joined them, though Sparta's traditional rival in the Peloponnese, Argos, stayed neutral, and Athens's northern neighbor, Thebes, ended up fighting on the Persian side. A small Spartan-led force heroically but unsuccessfully resisted the Persian advance at Thermopylae. Not long after, the Persians were ignominiously defeated at sea at the Battle of Salamis, and the following year on land at the Battle of Plataea. The Greeks' stand against the mighty Persians was a formative experience, recounted for us with great literary skill half a century later by Herodotus, the father of history. The threat of a Persian conquest of mainland Greece fell away then and was never revived. The Athenians went on to liberate the Greek cities of the islands of the Aegean Sea and the western shore of Asia Minor from their Persian overlords. But then they converted the cross-Aegean naval confederacy created to counter the Persians into an Athenian empire. It was not long before Athens and Sparta were bitterly hostile to each other. They fought one inconclusive war about which we know little in the 450s, and then in 431 they began what is known to us as the Peloponnesian War. The first 2 decades of this conflict were chronicled by a contemporary, the Athenian Thucydides, one of the greatest historians of all time. Thucydides' narrative breaks off in the autumn of 411, and Xenophon's history begins at roughly the same point. A little earlier, the Persians reappeared in the story, trying to use the Greek conflict and Athens's difficulties to their advantage in reasserting their position over the Greeks of Asia Minor. That is the situation on the first page of the Hellenica, where the Spartans are being supported in their struggle against Athens by Pharnabazos, the Persian satrap or governor of Hellespontine Phrygia, in northwest Asia Minor. Much of the hostility between Athens and Sparta might be described as great power rivalry, but there was also an ideological element. Athens, you see, was a direct democracy, important policy decisions being taken by an assembly in which all citizens could readily participate, and those citizens making up a large majority of the adult Greek male cities living in Attica. Athens had been a democracy since the end of the 6th century. During the 5th century, Athenian institutions had become yet more democratic. The active politicians had been drawn from widening social circles, and enthusiasm for democracy had led Athens to proselytize among Athenian subjects and allies, although cities ruled by traditional aristocracies were not forced to become democracies unless they had rebelled. The Spartans, by contrast, tended to support oligarchies, both among their neighboring allies, the Peloponnesian League, and elsewhere. Sparta's own constitution is difficult to characterize succinctly, but it was not a classic oligarchy. For one thing, there were two hereditary kings who retained quite a lot of power and acted as the principal generals. For another, the citizen body was reasonably numerous and had the right to attend an assembly, which elected various officials and voted on whether or not to go to war. But more steadily influential than the assembly was a small council, largely elected for life, which was a typically oligarchic feature. Moreover, the number of citizens was smaller than in Athens, and the number was constantly shrinking, principally because of the way in which the Spartan system of land tenure interacted with qualifications for full citizenship. Most important of all, Sparta's citizens were a small segment of the Greek adult males in Laconia and Messenia, the two territories the Spartans directly controlled. The majority of the inhabitants, though Greeks like the Spartans, were unfree. They were the so-called helots, who were tied to the land in a special form of state serfdom. A sizable number of the free Greeks did not have full citizen rights, so Sparta had a good reason for not encouraging the extension of political power to the poorer classes in neighboring states. And conversely, aristocrats and others among the rich, even in Athens, had some reason to look favorably on the methods by which the Spartan elite stayed in control. According to Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War that had broken out in 431 was caused by Sparta's fear and jealousy of Athens's growing power. But after a decade of fighting, the parties concluded a stalemate peace, the Peace of Nicias, named for the Athenian general who led the negotiations. It was an uneasy truce, punctuated by military activity on both sides, that fell short of full-scale war, though. In 415, the Athenians sent a massive expedition against the Sicilian city of Syracuse in an attempt to ensure, among other things, that Syracuse's resources could not be used to support Sparta in any further conflict. However, the expedition was crippled shortly after it began when Alcibiades, one of the three generals in command and the venture's principal proponent, was forced to flee into exile as a result of accusations of impiety. In 413, the expedition was totally destroyed, with a huge loss of ships and men. By this time, the Spartans had revived their war effort, and they redoubled it the following year, as many Athenian subject allies in the Aegean, emboldened by Athens's defeat in Sicily, revolted. The Persians now began to fish in these troubled waters, and before long formally reached agreement with the Spartans on the terms of an alliance against Athens, under which it was envisioned that the Persians were to control the Greek cities of Asia Minor. In 411, the strain of the war led to a temporary collapse of democratic self-confidence in Athens and the imposition of an oligarchic regime known as the 400. The oligarchs, however, fell out among themselves regarding whether to surrender to Sparta. The extreme oligarchs who wanted to capitulate lost out to a more moderate group led by one Theramenes, and the 400 were then replaced by a wider oligarchy, the so-called 5,000, which later slid back into full democratic governance. In the meantime, the Athenian fleet, based on the East Aegean island of Samos, had remained true to the democracy throughout and had won a famous victory against the Spartan fleet in the Hellespont at the Battle of Kynosema in the summer of 411, thanks to a decisive intervention by none other than Alcibiades, whom the fleet had recalled from exile. And it is shortly after this battle that Thucydides breaks off his narrative, and not long thereafter that our Xenophon takes up his tale of the Hellenica. What happened next? So far, we have come to the period that the Hellenica covers, and one might hope to leave it to Xenophon to tell that story. But as I said earlier, he presupposes a lot of knowledge on the part of his readers, and it is one of his most striking characteristics, actually, as a historian, that he leaves out many things that in any conventional view would count among the most important events of the period he covers. So some kind of opening sketch may help orient the modern reader, and that is what I intend to give right now. As I've already mentioned, shortly before Hellenica begins, the Spartans and the Persians had become allies. But while Persia's satrap in the north of Western Asia Minor, Pharnabazos, lived up to the agreement, the southern satrap, one Tissaphernes, temporized about fulfilling Persia's treaty obligations to maintain the Spartan fleet. Partly because of this, Athens succeeded in holding out for a further 6.5 years. To start with, the Athenians obtained notable successes under the leadership of Alcibiades, in particular the Battle of Cyzicus in early 410. But the Athenians dismissed him again, and Cyrus, the younger son, that is, of Darius II, the great king of Persia, brought the full extent of Persia's vast financial resources to bear in support of Sparta. Eventually, in 405, the canny Spartan admiral Lysander won a decisive victory at the Battle of Aegospotamoi, where he captured almost the entire Athenian fleet. In the spring of 404, after a long siege, he forced Athens to capitulate. The Athenians then suffered a more violent period of oligarchy, when Lysander compelled them to subject themselves to a group of 30 men called the 30, really the 30 tyrants, that were as contemporaries and later generations would call them. The 30 included Theramenes, and as he had been one of the 400 7 years earlier, he tried to moderate their course. But this time he lost to the extremists, who were led by an embittered former exile and none other than a relative of the philosopher Plato, one Critias. Theramenes was executed, and something of a reign of terror ensued until the Spartan government, fed up for many reasons with Lysander and his cronies, switched course and forced a reconciliation between the oligarchic regime in the city and an armed band under an Athenian named Thrasybulus that had taken over Athens's port, the Piraeus. So it was in 403 the democracy was restored. Although it was only for a short period after their victory over Athens that Sparta engaged in or winked at atrocities in Athens and in several other cities, the Spartan domination of Greece was quickly resented, not only by Athens, but also by Sparta's previous allies, Corinth and Thebes. Sparta also forfeited the support of Persia, now under a new great king, Artaxerxes II. Having defeated a rebellion by Sparta's friend Cyrus at the Battle of Cunaxa, 401, Artaxerxes set about restoring Persia's former control of the Greek cities of Asia Minor. Although the Spartans had agreed to Persian control of these cities a decade earlier, now they sent troops to Asia Minor to resist the Persians, climaxing in 396 with the dispatch of one of their two kings, Agesilaus, to lead their forces there. But after a striking success at the Battle of Sardis, his expedition was cut short. Sparta had to recall him to deal with a renewed outbreak of war in continental Greece when Corinth, Thebes, and Athens joined together to fight Sparta in what became known to modern historians as the Corinthian War, which lasted from 395 to 386. Persia this time financed a fleet on the anti-Spartan side, and under Pharnabazos and the Athenian Conon, it won a decisive victory at the Battle of Cnidus, that is in 394. Although Spartans had to abandon their attempt to free the Greek cities of Asia Minor from Persia, the Asian Greeks gained nothing, even when King Artaxerxes switched his support back to Sparta in exasperation at Athenian attempts to revive their interests along the coast of Asia Minor and to dabble in Cyprus and Egypt. Persian control over the Asia Minor seaboard was reaffirmed by the peace terms that Artaxerxes successfully dictated in 386. This is the so-called King's Peace. Artaxerxes, revealed as the arbiter of the Greek world now, had achieved even more power in the West than his early 5th century predecessors had won with their direct imperialism. Through the King's Peace, the Spartans were again dominant in continental Greece. Their position might seem even more powerful than it had been in 404. They broke up the Akkadian city of Mantinea into 4 villages and intervened successfully in nearby Phleos. Outside the Peloponnese, they conquered Olynthus on the North Aegean coast and also assisted one Theban faction to come to power against its rival, occupying the Theban citadel with their own troops in 382. Shocking even to sympathetic contemporaries such as Xenophon himself. But the wheel of fortune turned. A tiny band of exiles succeeded in liberating Thebes in midwinter of 379 to 378, and Athens and Thebes once again stood together against Sparta in the Boeotian War, which stretched from 378 till 371, with a brief interval of peace in 375/374. 2 factors were crucial to the revival of Athenian fortunes. The Athenians managed to induce some of their former Aegean allies to join them once again in a naval alliance. This is the Second Athenian League, with greater safeguards against Athenian misuse of their position of alliance leaders. And they also persuaded Artaxerxes to stand aside and even to press Sparta to accept the new situation. The Thebans were successful as well, reuniting Boeotia under their control, though their methods ultimately so alienated the Athenians that they deserted Thebes and agreed to the peace of 372-371, when Artaxerxes seems to have been, again, tilted in the Spartan direction. But the reunited Boeotians astonished the whole Greek world when, led by the intelligent and charismatic Theban Epaminondas, they crushed the Spartan army under King Cleombrotus of Leuctra at Leuctra in midsummer of 371, the first defeat of the Spartans by other Greeks in a full-blown pitched battle for well over 150 years. And so ended the Spartan hegemony over Greece. And very shortly afterward, the Thebans ended Sparta's older hegemony over the Peloponnese, and even Spartan control over Messina in the southwest of the Peloponnese. At one time, the Messenians had been independent of Sparta, but they had been conquered centuries earlier. And now in 369, Messenia was restored to independence by an invading army under Epaminondas. 5 times in the 360s, Theban armies penetrated the Peloponnese, and as a consequence, it became obvious to all but the Spartans themselves, and a few of their diehard supporters, that Messenia was destined to remain independent. The Theban expeditions also ensured that Megalopolis, a city near Sparta's northern border, founded by the Arcadians after Leuctra and fortified over the following years, that it too would also remain as a check on Spartan ambitions, even though Arcadia itself had since split into pro and anti-Theban factions. To the indignation of Sparta's supporters, in 367, the Theban Peloponnesos persuaded the Persians to accept the situation brought about by Leuctra and the liberation of Messenia and switch away from the Spartans again, recognizing Thebes as the leading state in Greece. This diplomatic effort misfired at first, partly because Thebes and Persia did not initially appreciate that a stable settlement required them to make concessions to Athens. But in 366, most Greek states, other than Sparta, recognized the liberation of Messenia. Meanwhile, the Athenians, though impelled during 369 to 366 by distrust of Thebes to act in alliance with Sparta within the Peloponnese, were more concerned with reviving the Aegean Empire they had created in the 5th century. Although the Athenians seem to have conducted themselves within or fairly close to the letter of their commitments to the members of the Second Athenian League, they did not over time remain true to the promises to the Aegean islanders that they had proclaimed in the 370s. Athens used the League and its resources on long-running campaigns of little benefit to the Allies, mostly in attempts to conquer the city of Amphipolis from 368 and the Thracian Chyrnesis from 365. Slightly earlier in 365, the Athenian general Timotheus had retaken the island of Samos from the control of a Persian interloper. Athens then expelled the Samians and assigned their lands to colonies of Athenian citizens. The same hard-nosed attitude prevailed in Athenian attitudes towards Sparta. In 366, the Athenians were persuaded by Persian concessions on Athens's role in the Aegean to leave Sparta out in the cold and sign up for the general peace that recognized the independence of Messenia. Admittedly, Athens and Sparta once again fought on the same side in 364 to 362, but the Athenians were not motivated by love of Sparta. Rather, it was because of a desire to substitute Athenian influence for that of Thebes and Arcadia that the Spartans did this. In 362, after the Battle of Mantinea, in effect, basically it was a draw, as Epaminondas, even though he was victorious, was killed in the hour of victory. Athens and all the other mainland Greek states, except Sparta, entered into one common peace to which Messenia was admitted as a party. Xenophon breaks off his work with the death of Epaminondas on the battlefield of Mantinea. The subsequent common peace confirmed Sparta's fall from dominance. Greece, south of Thessaly, was now widely governed by democracies, and it was possible to imagine that the region might enter an era of comparative peace and stability, though that is emphatically not the way that Xenophon presents it, nor is it the view adopted by those many modern historians who follow his lead here. We need to continue the story a little further, because though the events retailed in the Hellenica end in 362, Xenophon's account naturally took time to write and was finished a little later. And it can be shown that the passage on Thessaly in Hellenica, Book 6, Chapter 4, verses 33 through 37, must have been written between 357 and 353. Within that period, winter of 356 to 355, to my mind, that is the likeliest date for this final composition, because Xenophon completed his work then, and he expected his first audience to read it at this time, in the knowledge of a further 6 years of events. You see, there were two key developments in 357, both of which crucially destabilized Greece and opened the way for the extinction of the liberty of the city-states in the following decades. In that year, 357, Athens' most powerful Aegean allies rebelled, spurred on by the representative of the Persian Empire in Caria, the satrap Mausolus. The consequent war, known to us as the Social War, which comes from the Latin meaning of the word social, meaning having to do with allies, the War of the Allies. This social war was still going on when Xenophon wrote, if he was doing so in the winter of 356 to 355. The war ended in mid-355 when a virtually bankrupt Athens had to let the rebels secede after the great king of Persia, now no longer Artaxerxes, but his son Artaxerxes III, after it was after now this man, Artaxerxes III, threatened to intervene on their side, a threat that had become a familiar motif of 4th century history to this date. Also, in 357, the Thebans felt strong enough to push for the final ruin of both Sparta and the city-state Phocis, that is Boeotia's neighbor and an even older enemy of Thebes. Thebes manipulated the Amphictyonic League, the international body that controlled the sacred shrine and oracle of Apollo at Delphi, and they manipulated this league into imposing massive fines on the Phocians for cultivating sacred land, that is, for harvesting olives that were part of and selling them off, that were on part of the sacred territory of the oracle. And they did so also because they did on Sparta for having occupied the Theban citadel in 382, more than 20 years earlier. But this Theban skullduggery, to call it what it is, lit the fuse that ultimately ended the power and even existence of the state of Thebes and destroyed the liberty of Greece. The Phocians did not take their punishment lying down. Encouraged by King Archidamus III of Sparta, they seized Delphi. In late 356, when Xenophon was probably putting the final touches on his work, the Hellenica, they were nerving themselves to finance their defense against the outraged Amphictyonic League by appropriating the huge wealth that the pious had given to the Delphic shrine over the centuries. It must have been a time of anguish for Xenophon, a deeply religious supporter of Delphi, who, though he strongly disapproved of Sparta's treatment of Thebes in 382 to 379, still greatly preferred his former patrons at Sparta to their enemy Thebes. The ultimate victor in the 4th century was not Sparta, nor Athens, nor Thebes, nor even Persia, but a new power player on the scene that we have not yet talked about, and that is Macedon, a state almost unmentioned in the Hellenica, for the good reason that it kept falling to pieces until Philip II, the father of Alexander the Great, succeeded to power there in 360/359. Philip II, once he assumed the throne, then set out by astute and, one might say, cynical diplomacy, and above all, by the creation of a formidable fighting machine, to unify his realm, to deter the aggressors on its borders, and to essentially dominate Greece. The sacred war between the Amphictyonic League and the Phocians gave him crucial opportunities, of which he took prompt advantage. But even before it broke out, he had captured Amphipolis and Pydna. Philip's looming shadow may perhaps explain why Xenophon gives so much space to the opportunities and threats presented to Sparta, and hence to Greece in the north, first by the Olynthians, this would be in Book 5, Chapter 2 onwards, and then by Jason of Pherae, whose dominance in Thessaly in the late 370s Xenophon deals with at length in Book 6, Chapter 1, 4 through 4 onwards. As I've already indicated, Xenophon's first readers would not have needed the Hellenica to tell them about the main facts of the sketch that I've just presented for you. For example, they would all have heard about the 30 tyrants of Athens in 404, or the Battle of Leuctra in 371, and the Second Athenian League, and so on. But there are two other topics that most of the initial audience would have borne in mind when reading the work, but that readers today need to be told about, and those are Xenophon's life and Xenophon's other works. And so it is to those subjects that I would now like to turn. Xenophon was probably born around 430 or a little later, just after the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, into an Athenian family that was rich enough to own horses, which meant rich, but was perhaps not quite the cream of the aristocracy. On reaching manhood, he no doubt fought for Athens in the last decade of the 5th century, and he almost certainly served in the cavalry, an elite corps that gave especially strong support to the 30 tyrants. Most of his first audience would have been well aware of this even before starting to read the Hellenica. Moreover, probably every reader among his contemporaries would have known that in 401, 2 years after the restoration of democracy, Xenophon embarked on a great adventure. He joined the forces being raised by Artaxerxes II's brother Cyrus, who, as mentioned just a moment ago, was making a bid for the Persian throne. It had been the 16-year-old Cyrus who had thrown the full weight of Persian money behind the Spartans and against the Athenians. But when his father Darius died, it was not Cyrus, but his elder brother Artaxerxes who had succeeded to the throne. Cyrus, with 10,000 Greek mercenaries and about twice as many from Asia, marched from Sardis in western Asia Minor further inland to Mesopotamia, where he fell at the Battle of Cunaxa. His Greek troops had to make their own way back to the Greek world, their difficulties increasing along the way because the Persians were treacherously had treacherously arrested and executed all but one of their most senior officers. The 10,000 fought their way northward, harassed by native tribes and enduring harsh weather conditions until they came to the Black Sea coast and ultimately to the Hellespont. Now led by Xenophon, they eventually joined up with the Spartan army, then on its anti-Persian campaign in Asia Minor. The story became common knowledge in Greece, being grist for the mill of people like the Athenian orator, teacher, and pamphleteer Isocrates, who in his Panegyricus of 380 argued that it all showed what a pushover the Persians would be if the Greeks launched a crusade against them. Most of the readers of the Hellenica would also have known about this episode from Xenophon's own account of it in his work The Anabasis, or the March Up Country, which made so much of his part in the proceedings that he found it prudent to put it out under the pseudonym of Themisteniges of Syracuse, to whom he attributes it in Book 3, Chapter 1. Readers of Xenophon's Anabasis, and probably most Athenians, would have been aware of what followed. Xenophon joined the Spartan expeditions to Asia in the early years of the 4th century, and so it was in 396 to 394 that Xenophon served under the Spartan king Agesilaus, when the latter came out to crusade in person. When the Corinthian War broke out in 395 and Agesilaus was recalled to mainland Greece, Xenophon accompanied him and so would have been present at the Battle of Coronea, where Athens was among the cities whose troops were ranged against the returning Spartan force. Through an adverse judgment by the Athenians, Xenophon found himself formally in exile from Athens. It is not clear to us exactly when this happened, but it occurred between 399 and 394. And some, perhaps a minority of scholars, would even fix it at precisely the year 396. It is interesting to note that Xenophon never expresses bitterness about his exile, so presumably he accepted that he had done something to deserve it. But in any event, he could not go back to Athens. And so at some point after 394, though perhaps not immediately, he was settled by the Spartans in the northwest Peloponnese on an estate at Scyllus, near Olympia. And he tells us this detail himself in his Anabasis, Book 5, Chapter 3, Verse 7. This estate was on territory previously owned by Elis, the city-state to the north of Scyllus. And there he lived as a country gentleman for about 20 years, until he lost the estate after the Battle of Leuctra, when the Eleans forcibly repossessed their outlying lands in the wake of the Spartan defeat. Shortly thereafter, he took up residence in Corinth, and whether Xenophon ever came back to live in Athens is a controversial question even today. His first readers obviously knew the truth of that question one way or another, and they could judge the tone of his references to Athens accordingly, but we do not know the answer to that question, and so we are in the dark about that matter. What we do know, though, and what every Athenian reader in the 350s would have known, is that he was the father of a great Athenian hero, the cavalryman Gryllus, whose gallant exploits against the Thebans at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 were depicted by the painter Euphranor in one of Athens's chief public buildings, the Painted Stoa. So high was Gryllus's reputation that subsequent generations of Athenians came to believe that Euphranor's painting depicted Gryllus slaying the Theban general Epaminondas. But no one in the 350s would have made that mistake. They would have recognized that when at Hellenica 7:5:17, that is Book 7, Chapter 5, verse 17, Xenophon describes in some detail a cavalry engagement that took place on the day before the main battle in which Epaminondas was killed, and remarks that good men were killed on both sides, and he is commemorating his own son's death. The memorial is the more fitting for Xenophon's air of impartial objectivity. He doesn't even mention Gryllus's name, and he also carefully suppressed the names of all other Athenians who participated in that battle. Most scholars believe that Xenophon's exile was revoked in the 360s, and they point to the facts that during those years, his sons fought for Athens, and he himself wrote the Hipparchikos, that is his work on cavalry command. It is a work directed in detail at an Athenian audience, you see, and seeking to help the Athenian military effort. Many, but not all, of those scholars think he went back to live in Athens, therefore. And this is not the place, really, in my talk right now for a detailed argument, although it is my minority view that Xenophon's right to live in Athens had been reinstated in 386, since it is likely that the king's peace of that year prescribed that all exiles, except murderers, should be restored in all their respective cities. However, Xenophon chose instead to stay at Scylla, and when he was turned out of Scylla by the Eleans, he chose to try his luck at Corinth, and that must be significant in assessing his attitude toward Athens. But Xenophon probably did go back to Athens eventually, perhaps when the Corinthians expelled their Athenian garrison in 366, as he tells us in Hellenica 7:4. If so, when it was just a coincidence that he died in Corinth, as purported by the late writer Diogenes Laertius. Other details of Xenophon's life, just such as the date of his marriage, are even more obscure to us and were not necessarily clear to many of his first readers. But more important than anything like that, and even more important than the truth of various other scraps from later sources, is the fact of whether anything else about Xenophon's life can be recovered from the way in which he wrote the Hellenica, you see. Where it is vivid and detailed, does this show that he was an actual witness, or is it the art of the writer? Sometimes it is very tempting to infer the former. For instance, in Book 1, Chapter 2, 1 through 13, he tells us about a campaign in Ionia by the Athenian general Thrasyllus in extraordinary detail, but to no obvious point. That has suggested to some that he may be giving us his memoirs of his own first serious military campaign. Similarly, when Xenophon seems to see the rule of the 30 from the point of view of a number of their cavalry, this is likely to be, some have argued, because he himself served in that capacity, although he does not say so explicitly. This is, in any case, likely, I think, from his age at the time and the abundant evidence of his horsemanship. But vividness is a dangerous criterion by which we can infer personal witness, since Xenophon can also write vividly about events at which we know for a fact he was not present, for example, events in Europe when he was in Asia. One other fact about Xenophon is known and will certainly have been in the minds of his first readers. Perhaps he would have said it was the most important thing, actually, in his life. He was a devoted admirer of the notorious wise man, mystic, and sort of patron of philosophy, Socrates, who was put to death by the Athenians in 399, ostensibly for introducing new gods and for corrupting the city's youth. Despite Xenophon's devotion, he had sidestepped Socrates' efforts to persuade him not to go on Cyrus's expedition, as is recounted in the Anabasis, Book 3, Chapter 1, 4 through 8. But Xenophon's subsequent difficulties confirmed to him how wise Socrates had been. and he later wrote 4 works in which Socrates is the main character. Socrates denied that he was truly wise and said he was merely a lover of wisdom, a philosopher. He himself wrote nothing, but his numerous disciples in the next generation were prolific, especially Plato, of whom it has been famously said by the American philosopher Alfred North Whitehead that the entire Western tradition of philosophy consists merely of a series of footnotes to Plato. The differences between Xenophon's portrait of Socrates and that in Plato's dialogues, and for that matter, between the two of them and the Socrates who appears in the comic playwright Aristophanes' Clouds, constitutes one of the great problems of classical scholarship. Plato's Socrates is very interested in metaphysics and epistemology. He is shown frequently engaging in destructive cross-examination of opponents, and he espouses some peculiar and distinctive views, in particular that the good man never harms anyone, even his enemies, and that virtue consists of knowledge. To be contrasted with that, though, Xenophon's Socrates often concerns himself with practical matters, is shown acting as a sort of therapist to his friends, and apparently has much more conventional views. But Socrates makes only a brief appearance in the Hellenica, when presiding by chance over the Athenian assembly in 406, he defies the mob that is howling for the blood of 6 Athenian generals. This is recounted in Book 1, Chapter 7, 15. Xenophon had said what he had to say about Socrates elsewhere, and saw no reason to repeat himself, therefore, at this section. And perhaps he means to imply that Hellenica's world of politics, war, and diplomacy benefits from prudence, but has no place for true wisdom. But this is a sort of impossible thing to sort of come to firm conclusions about. This is simply speculation. There are many other works by Xenophon. 15 works, actually, were transmitted through antiquity under Xenophon's name, and fortunately, all 15 have come down to us. However, almost all modern scholars agree on stylistic grounds that what has been transmitted to us as the constitution of the Athenians is not by Xenophon. Indeed, most scholars believe that one particular observation in it predates the year 424, so the work was therefore written before Xenophon reached adulthood. There is some ancient evidence to support the modern view, since Diogenes Laertius, the biographer of ancient philosophers, tells us that the first-century scholar Demetrius of Magnesia denied the authenticity of a work to which he gives the title The Constitution of the Athenians and of the Lacedaemonians. Scholars in the last 2 centuries have raised serious doubts about several of the other 14 works, especially 2 of them, the Constitution of the Lacedaemonians and the Kunageticus. But the general, although not universal, consensus today is that all 14 are genuine. The order and date of the 14 works are much debated. It would take us too far away from the Hellenica to do justice to those arguments, so I will just state my own views here briskly. Xenophon's first publication was probably the Kunageticus, dating perhaps from around 390. The work gives advice on hunting, especially on Athenian methods of what we know today as beagling, that is, hunting hares on foot with hounds that track their prey by scent. Then there was a long gap in publication, but not necessarily in writing, perhaps broken in the late 370s with his rendition of Socrates' Apology, that is, his account of Socrates' defense speech to the jury in 399. Xenophon wrote after this, and presumably in rivalry with one of Plato's most famous works, his version of Socrates' speech, which Plato, unlike Xenophon, was there to hear. Probably in the early 360s, Xenophon brought out his Anabasis, telling of his part in Cyrus's expedition, the return of the 10,000 Greek mercenaries in Cyrus's army, and their subsequent adventures, until just before they joined the Spartan forces in Asia Minor. At about this time, Xenophon also published his Memorabilia, an extended defense of Socrates' virtues as a teacher and citizen. And this was followed by two further Socratic works, the Symposium, a portrait of a more playful Socrates at a fictional party given by the young Callias, an Athenian aristocrat who turns up in the Hellenica in an old age, making a rather pompous speech, and also his work, the Economicus, a Socratic dialogue on the principles of household and estate management, which contains a hidden message that the life of members of the landed gentry, such as Xenophon himself, is second best to the life of Socrates. Another dialogue, his Hiero, perhaps not written until the following decade, also features a wise man, not, to be sure, Socrates, but the less savory 5th century poet Simonides, who tries to show Hiero, the autocrat of Syracuse, how he could live in happiness if he adopted less arbitrary and more beneficial policies towards his subjects. Very probably in 365, Xenophon put out his Hipparchicus, his useful manual of advice for Athenian cavalry commanders, followed, how much later is unclear, by another manual on horsemanship, on how to look after horses. At the end of his this prolific decade, he published his most technically innovative work, the Cyropaideia, or Education of Cyrus, a cross between a historical novel about the 6th century founder of the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Elder, and a technical military manual, and also a political moral treatise. Modern scholars disagree about what the moral is supposed to be, but that is, in some sense, what it is. After 360 came his work, the Agesilaus, a laudatory memorial to the Spartan king with whom Xenophon served in 396 to 394. And despite much dispute, the Hellenica itself, incontrovertibly finished in the 350s, should also largely be regarded as a work of this late period. Although, as we will see, the beginning around, Book 1, Chapter 1, to around Book 2, Chapter 2, was written much earlier. Most likely in the summer of 355, as the social war came to its unfortunate end, and thus probably after the completion of the Hellenica, Xenophon wrote his Porroi, which is usually translated as Ways and Means, a short treatise on how Athens could recover from war by developing existing economic resources. Finally, his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians seems to have been found among Xenophon's papers after his death, his Nachlass, as it is said in German, presumably alongside the non-Xenophontic Constitution of the Athenians, having been put aside by him unfinished. He probably wrote it in 378 to 377. If one surveys this corpus of work as a whole, it becomes apparent that Xenophon was interested in experimenting with the structure of his works and with developing new genres of writing. He kept tight control over his material, much more than first appears, and enjoyed playing with the expectations of his readers. Although his works cover many different genres, his style is generally consistent. The Kunageticus and the beginning of the Hellenica are comparative exceptions, I'd say, as to also a lesser extent is Constitution of the Lacedaemonians. And many themes resurface in several works, especially the desirability of physical toil and self-control, and the importance of good leadership for states and especially for armies. Two of these works deserve more comment, though, here. His Constitution of the Lacedaemonians is a problematic work, and much about it is controversial. The work is ostensibly written to show how Sparta's success is built on the Spartans' civil and military institutions, including their, no other word for it, bizarre educational practices that they referred to as the agoge, or brutal military training, which also included encouraging teenage boys to learn how to steal. And in all but one of its chapters, Sparta appears to be an object of praise for this. But the penultimate chapter is a strong denunciation of the contemporary Spartans for being untrue to their own ideals. Despite a number of apparent contradictions between this chapter and the preceding ones, on close reading, most contradictions disappear, however. But the work is still inconsistent on the central point of whether the Spartans obey their ancestral laws. Probably this is because the draft is not in final form, you see. Xenophon could hardly have written a denunciation of Sparta while he was on campaign with the Spartan army, or published it while he was still a Spartan dependent in Scylos. But his complaints presuppose a continuing background of Spartan governors abroad, and this was not the case after Leuctra in 371. And so we can see that already in the 370s, Xenophon was of two minds about the Spartans, or at least about the Sparta for whose service he had deserted his native city. He was of two minds to such an extent that he could not get his exposition of his position to come out right, and so therefore he put it aside. The second work requiring further comment is his Aegis, in some ways a much shorter companion piece to the Hellenica. As befits an encomium, a work of praise, Agesilaus depicts a virtually flawless king, whereas as one sees him in the Hellenica, he is not without his blemishes. The depiction of Agesilaus's Asian expedition, for instance, in 396 to 394, is very similar in the two works, but the precise wording differs. Xenophon evidently took the earlier version and went over it with considerable care to produce the later one. Unfortunately, it is difficult to tell whether he toned down the expansive and confident remarks and the elevated vocabulary of his Agesilaus so as to produce a more measured, objective, and strictly correct Hellenica, or whether he started with the apparently straightforward account in Hellenica and both expurgated it and pepped it up to produce a more fitting obituary notice for his dead leader. The changes in vocabulary and emphasis can be used to argue in either direction, but there is one point, less often emphasized, that shows that Agesilaus was written before at least the second half of Hellenica. At Agesilaus, Book 2, Chapter 20, Xenophon briefly describes a campaign by Agesilaus during the early 380s against the Acarnanians, who lived to the northwest of the Corinthian Gulf. According to the manuscript text, which there is no intrinsic reason to doubt, although some determined agnostics have felt the need to do so, Agesilaus dislodged the enemy from the hilltops by sending up light-armed men, the type of troops better fitted to difficult terrain. Xenophon relates the same incident at greater length in the Hellenica, Book 4, Chapter 6, 4 through 12, but here it is charges uphill by heavy infantry that dislodge the Acarnanians, a much more striking feat. Nowhere does it seem likely that Xenophon simply made up his stories, although he may have twisted some of them in the telling. So it appears that the circumstantial detail in the Hellenica version broadly represents the truth. And if that is so, we can deduce that the version of Agesilaus, the version in the Agesilaus, is a garbled account from limited information, and Xenophon learned the details of what really happened in the time span between the writing of the two works. Before taking up the Hellenica, most of Xenophon's first readers would have read earlier historians, and this would have conditioned them on what to expect from a work of history. Xenophon will have borne this fact in mind when he wrote. Indeed, he invites comparison with predecessors explicitly in Book 7, Chapter 2, 1. When he says that other writers concentrate on big cities, but he will also write of the deeds of a small one, Phleus. Implicitly, too, in Book 5, Chapter 1, 4, he contrasts his history, which tells how the Spartan admiral Telutius inspired his men, with other histories, which pass over that sort of thing and deal instead with money, danger, and stratagems. Some Greek historians who had published before 356 are just mere names to us, and from others we have only a few lines. But of course, we do have the two most important, which you see in front of you, Herodotus and Thucydides, who have come down to us in full. Herodotus wrote in the 430s and 420s about the great Persian expedition against Greece of 480 to 479 and much else besides. Thucydides took the history of the Peloponnesian War as his subject, but although he mentions its end in 404, he did not write a narrative of the last 7 years of the war, ending instead in the autumn of 411. The last sentence of his history leaves the Persian satrap Tissaphernes in mid-journey from Aspendos in the south to the Hellespont via Ephesus, and manifestly marks the work as unfinished. Thucydides evidently left it incomplete at his death, probably in the 390s. Thucydides and Herodotus approached historical narrative in different ways, leaving Xenophon with a choice as to which to follow. Xenophon, in his Hellenica, scarcely ever echoes Herodotus, or tries to bring his history directly to mind. But the general flavor of Xenophon's work has seemed to many people to be closer to Herodotus than to Thucydides. Herodotus writes in a simple and engaging style. His work is replete with anecdotes and suffused by divine intervention. Thucydides writes in a highly contorted way, with many abstract nouns. He is an austere narrator of military and diplomatic events, but he never evinces belief in the gods. He never, in fact, he's quite dismissive, especially of oracles and of things like that. And he certainly does not apply any kind of belief in the gods influencing human affairs. And so in these three aspects, Xenophon is much more like Herodotus. However, Herodotus and Thucydides offered Xenophon a choice of models in other ways. And in these respects, he seems to have favored Thucydides. For instance, while the underlying movement of Herodotus's history is chronological, progressing through the history of the Persian Empire from the 550s to 479, he is constantly flying off on a tangent to other places, to other peoples and periods. Whereas by contrast, after Thucydides' first book, and once his narrative reaches the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides writes in strict analytic format, with few digressions. Whereas Herodotus is constantly assigning stories to sources and other he often gives rival versions of events with discussion as to which one we are to, what are we to make of it all. Thucydides never names his sources, and it is rare for him to discuss them and their disagreements, although he does make a couple of methodological pronouncements, famously in Book 1, Chapter 22, about the speeches. That shows that he was fully aware of the difficulties of reconciling evidence and separating the true from the false. Whereas Herodotus is always at the reader's side, giving his opinions and filling his history with his chatty and curious personality. Thucydides, by contrast, derives authority from creating the impression of a magisterial objectivity and refers to himself in the third person when he has to narrate his own actions as an Athenian general. And finally, although Herodotus no doubt winnowed and selected from the various reports he gathered, his work gives the impression that he has tried to find a place for all sorts of information, whether or not relevant to his main theme. And that when he fails to tell us things he would like to know, this is usually not because he is withholding information, aside from a few kind of religious topics or taboo topics that he deliberately says, I'm not going to talk about that, but rather because he has been unable to find out the relevant facts. However, Thucydides must have struck contemporaries as very selective in his approach. For example, his account of the run-up to the Peloponnesian War almost completely omits material that later historians emphasized in their rival analyses of the war's causes. He gives us full speeches on both sides of just about everything, usually with only a couple of exceptions. And on just two occasions, just two of the hundreds of occasions when the Athenian orators clashed in the assemblies, he gives us these full speeches, and he largely ignores Persia's role in the war before 412. In all of these respects, Xenophon is more like Thucydides than he is like Herodotus. As regards chronology, he is not as strict as Thucydides, but he does proceed more or less chronologically, and he almost always signals his departures from chronological order. He is almost as austere in not indicating his sources as Thucydides. And on the other 2 points, he actually outdoes him. He is cavalier with omissions, and he keeps his own name altogether out of his work, even where he plays a part in events, for instance, at Hellenica, Book 3, Chapter 2, 7. When he is the leader of the mercenaries who had been with Cyrus. But we are not told that even though he's speaking about the leader of those mercenaries, and that is Xenophon himself, that he does not reveal that it was him. There is one final piece of background that we need to fill in. Xenophon's first readers could compare the first half of the Hellenica to another history of the 400s and the 390s, known to us today as the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia. And this work, the text of the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia, was lost in late antiquity, scholars having no knowledge of it until about 1906, when an extensive papyrus fragment was found in the preserved rubbish heap of the ancient Egyptian town known as Oxyrhynchus, and therefore its modern name, the name of this work. The fragment, the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia, gave a detailed account of the mid-390s that, although confirming Xenophon's narrative in very broad outline, both adds significantly to it and is at variance with it in important particulars. It does not name its author, but it is likely that he was an Athenian named Cratipus, who is known to have produced a history beginning around 411 and carrying it on into the late 390s, if not further. However, because this point is not universally agreed upon, I will just simply refer to the author of the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia, the Oxyrhynchus Hellenica, as P, which is the conventional way to do it. P meaning papyrus. We can also refer to him as the Oxyrhynchus historian. The fragment found in 1906 is known as the London fragment because it is now kept in London. Later in the 20th century, 2 shorter fragments were found that evidently belonged to the same history. And so, as the 3 fragments came from 3 different copies, we can gather that the book was fairly popular. The second fragment found is known as the Florentine fragment and gives a similarly detailed account of some incidents in the last decade of the Peloponnesian War, including the Battle of Notion, which was responsible for Alcibiades' losing his command for the second time. The third fragment, the shortest of these, is known as the Cairo fragment, and that covers an Athenian campaign in Western Asia Minor that took place a little bit earlier, in fact, the very campaign of Thrasyllus that, as I've already said, may well have been Xenophon's first campaign. The whole work then seems to have started in 412, shortly before Thucydides ends, at a more natural break in events. There is little evidence that it was published in 2 parts, with there is a little evidence that it was published in 2 parts, with a break in 430. We can see that it continued to at least 395, and it probably ended with the king's peace of 386. Whether or not its author was Cratipus, the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia was written in the first half of the 4th century. It contains a passage about the Phocians that must have been written before the destruction of Phocis in 346, and appears to precede the outbreak of the Sacred War of 356 to 346, which centered on Phocis. And this is the part of the fragment 21.3. Probably it was written a good deal earlier than 356, since the degree of detail included in it must have been collected soon after the events which it covers. A date well before Xenophon finished Hellenica would be beyond doubt, if we could prove that the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia was by this fellow Cratipus, since we know that he belonged to Thucydides' generation. So it is likely that while Xenophon was the first historian of the period 386 to 362, for the earlier period 411 to 386, he would have been able to read not only, he would have been able to read the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia. If Hellenica Oxyrhynchia were available to be read before Xenophon wrote his Hellenica, Xenophon surely would have taken the opportunity to read it, and he was far from ignoring what other people had written about his subjects, since his other works often start from another writer's book or carry on a dialogue with a predecessor in the relevant field. But if he did read Hellenica Oxyrhynchia, as I believe he did, he evidently did not think much of it, for the two works frequently disagree in emphasis and judgment, and on occasion directly contradict each other on factual matters. These disagreements are the more striking because Hellenica Oxyrhynchia seems to be a very professional piece of work. It has a plain, dry style, sparer than Xenophon's own, and without Xenophon's occasional vivid images and high-flown words. It incorporates a great deal of detail, such as the names of minor individuals and places, and seems to keep close to the hard facts. It appears to aim at a consistent level of treatment throughout the period it covers. In the fragments that we have, at least, there are no long speeches, and it is known that Cratylus objected to Thucydides's inclusion of speeches, which he considered boring and a distraction from the action. But this is not to say that the Oxyrhynchus historian wrote a bare chronicle. On the contrary, he analyzes political groups and includes arguments about the causes of events. He is more candid, indeed, than Thucydides, at least in the latter's main narrative, in acknowledging other views, and more specific in setting out his own reasoning. He displays an interest in political institutions when he describes the workings of the Boeotian Federation, for instance. Such an interest is foreign to Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon. One's natural first thought on reading this serious and careful work is that if Xenophon disagrees with it, so much the worse for Xenophon. Some say that the Oxyrhynchus historian's austerity and serious-mindedness is a facade, and that he slanted his narrative unfairly to convey his own views, and that he made up incidents when he had insufficient evidence with which to fill out his account. Certainly, the Oxyrhynchus historian, P., in the words of the scholars McKenney and Kern in their commentary on this document, quote, knew how to use a plain style to suggest and convince, end quote. And when the Oxyrhynchus historian tells us in fragment 23 how the Athenian general Conon suppressed a mutiny among his fleet at Caunus in 395, we can see that his narrative technique supports his thesis, that Conon was brave, prudent, and resourceful, as he surely was. And no doubt the Oxyrhynchus historian did not get everything right, but it is quite a different matter to allege that he made things up, and not only out of political bias, but sometimes from frivolous desire to pad out his history. Plainly, the Oxyrhynchus historian wishes to convey the impression that he is diligent in collecting evidence and careful in evaluating it, and he would hardly achieve this aim if still living eyewitnesses, or whatever political persuasion you might want, would flatly contradict him. Appendices to this work, which this edition that you can read by McKenney and Kern, go into more scholarly detail about the Oxyrhynchus historian, and also another writer that is helpful in elucidating this matter is the historian Diodorus Siculus. His work is a very different kettle of fish from the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia. Diodorus lived in the 1st century BC and wrote a universal history of the world in 40 books from its beginnings to his own day. The books that cover the Xenophontic period are books 13, 14, and 15, which ends in the year 361. Within these books, about half the narrative concerns Sicily, with a little on Italy, the rest being about Greece and to some extent Persia. Although some more recent scholars have discerned some signs of intelligence in Diodorus, it has long been recognized that he was a wretched historian who created his narrative largely, if not exclusively, by paraphrasing chunks of his predecessors' works in a most careless way. Generally, at least when dealing with mainland Greece, he followed one narrative source for a long period before switching over to another. He often botched this process by muddling names that the source gave correctly and by getting confused between his source's main narrative and introductions, digressions, and recapitulations. He tried to fit his source's narratives into a chronological framework drawn from a separate handbook, and he made astonishing mistakes in correlating the two. He kills off the 5th century Spartan king Archidamus II and the 4th century Athenian general Chabrias prematurely, and then refers to them as alive at a later date. One wonders whether he ever read his history all the way through again after writing his first draft. However, the sources that Diodorus mangled were generally good ones, not because he could judge their quality, but because he chose the best-known works in the field, provided they were reasonably easy to read. Therefore, if one can filter out his characteristic blunders, his history can be extremely important in reconstructing events, and hence in evaluating other historians such as Xenophon. For mainland Greece, in the Xenophontic period, Diodorus used an important 4th century historian named Ephorus, who wrote throughout the period 360 to 330 and composed the first universal history. This covered the whole Greek world from the mythical period to his own times. Although it survives only in short extracts, usually referred to by the numbers assigned to it by the great German historian Felix Jacobi, in his compilation of all surviving fragments of Greek historians. One of the things we are told about Ephorus is that he did not write analytically, that is, year by year, dealing with each year in turn, but habitually pursued different subjects beyond their strict chronological place. This is part of the evidence that Diodorus depended on him, because he explains why Diodorus had particular difficulty aligning the main narrative source for those years with the chronological handbook he used for his skeleton of dates. Diodorus did a much better job in his account of the very end of the 4th century, when he was following a different and presumably more straightforward source. It may be that Ephorus is not the source for absolutely everything in Diodorus's narrative of the Xenophontic period. Some people think that he lifted his account of the Battle of Leuctra from another source, but almost all of it must derive from Ephorus. Now, when the London fragment of the Hellenica Oxyrhynchia was found, scholars immediately inferred that what it said in fragments 14 and 15 about the Battle of Sardis of 395 was the ultimate source for Diodorus's version, Diodorus Book 1480, which scholars had previously spurned because it contradicted what is probably an eyewitness account in Xenophon, Hellenica, Book 3, Chapter 4, 21 through 24. Study of the second Florentine fragment, that is fragment 8, likewise suggested that Diodorus's account of the Battle of Notion in 406, which is talked about in Diodorus Book 13, Chapter 71 onwards, was derived from it. But this was not because Diodorus was using the Oxyrhynchus historian's work directly. The Hellenica Oxyrhynchia is an analytic history, and if Diodorus had had it in front of him, his chronology of the period around the end of the Peloponnesian War would not have been the mess that it is. Rather, Diodorus is abridging Ephorus, and Ephorus was in turn making use of the Oxyrhynchus historian. Ephorus was a serious historian, unlike Diodorus, and he would not have simply paraphrased the Oxyrhynchus historian. Indeed, we can see that throughout his work, he tried hard, sometimes too hard, to supplement the best primary source with other evidence. So presumably, there are some things in Diodorus's account of mainland Greece from the years 412 to 386 that did not derive from the Oxyrhynchus historian, but most of it probably does, although this valuable material is mixed up with Diodorus's blunders. Accordingly, since the discovery of the London papyrus in 1906, historians generally have given more weight to what Diodorus says about the first half of the 4th century than they did before. This is true not only for the period that the Oxyrhynchus historian covers, but also for the years after 386. Let us now return, after having surveyed those issues, to the opening words of the Hellenica, meta de tauta, and after these things, not many days later. Xenophon begins this way, expecting the reader to recognize that he is picking up roughly where Thucydides left off. The fit is not, in fact, watertight, but Thucydides stops and Xenophon starts in the autumn of 411, which is by no means a natural breaking point. And so Xenophon is evidently continuing Thucydides' work and is in some sense claiming to be a historian who can be compared with Thucydides. Now, of course, that was a bold and probably unwise claim, implicitly though it was made, as Thucydides set formidable standards of research and penetration. Presumably because he saw himself as continuing Thucydides, Xenophon did not follow his predecessors and provide a preface setting out the scope and methods of his work. It seems that he thought that this would be obvious. That was perhaps not so unreasonable for the narrative of the Peloponnesian War, and even beyond that, down to the overthrow of the 30 at the end of Book 2 of the Hellenica. Like Thucydides, Xenophon here proceeds year by year, although the modern reader has to be warned that this would not have been as clear in the original text of Hellenica as it is in the version that has come down to us, because later in antiquity, copyists added analytic material from other sources. Xenophon describes all the major battles that Athens fought in the East Aegean. He recounts at length only one debate in the assembly. This is in Book 1, Chapter 7, when Socrates obstructed, and one Euryptolemus spoke at length against a vote to condemn en bloc 6 Athenian generals for not rescuing shipwrecked Athenian sailors after the Battle of Arginousae. They were all condemned, nevertheless. But singling this debate out is not particularly surprising, since Thucydides had also chosen only a few specimen debates from the many possibilities that existed. Thucydides was obviously a great researcher, and Xenophon too must have talked to other people to produce his account of these years. He certainly wasn't at the first 2 battles he describes. His account of Arginousae, for instance, draws on information from both sides of the battle, and he often updates us on the number of ships on one or both sides. Also, like Thucydides, Xenophon in this section does not display obvious bias against either Athens or Sparta, and indeed he recounts what happened under the 30 in a way that shows he recognizes that he was wrong to have supported them, and wrong to have resisted the return of the democracy. So he makes an effort to be objective, and his choice of things to write about is fairly straightforward, although the amount of detail varies disconcertingly from incident to incident. When we turn to Diodorus for comparison, we get some surprises. On every one of the battles they both describe, their accounts seem remarkably different, sometimes so different that they seem to be writing about quite different battles, although at least the same side wins. One of the things that the study of the Florentine fragment of Hellenica Oxyrhynchia has shown is that this is misleading. The point is obscured a little because the papyrus is in tatters, but we can see that the Oxyrhynchus historian's account of the Battle of Notion, for instance, in 406, which is fragment 8 of Oxyrhynchus, was, as one would expect, fuller than both Xenophon's treatment in Book 1, Chapter 5, 12 through 14, and Diodorus's account in Book 13, 71, 2 through 4. And it makes sense of the apparently contradictory reports they give about the number of ships involved. Xenophon and Diodorus do not really disagree about the essentials, but they both select from the facts in such a way as to suggest a contradiction when there is only a difference in emphasis. This point generally applies. For most of these battles, the apparently contradictory accounts of Xenophon and Diodorus are more likely to be complementary. In the first battle that Xenophon describes at length in the Hellenica, that is of Dardanus versus Abydos, this is in Hellenica, Book 1, Chapter 1 2 through 7, and in Diodorus Siculus, book 13, chapter 45, 1 through 47, there is an apparent discrepancy, and it could arise because Xenophon's version may rely on information from Doriaeus the Rhodian, one of the main participants on the anti-Athenian side, whom Xenophon probably met later, after Doriaeus was, as Xenophon tells us, captured by the Athenians. In his second battle account, that of Cyzicus, which is written about in Hellenica, Book 1, Chapter 1, 14 through 19, and in Diodorus Siculus, Book 13, Chapters 49 through 51, it is impossible to square the two accounts on the issue of whether the Athenians caught the Spartan army, that is the navy, at sea, unawares, or whether they lured it out of port. But if we could read what the Oxyrhynchus historian had to say, we might see something that makes sense of both. Perhaps the Athenians set out intending to lure the Spartans out of port, as Diodorus says, but then found they didn't need to because the Spartans were already at sea, and so were caught unawares, as Xenophon describes. What Diodorus shows is not that Xenophon is wrong, but that he is selective, whether because he believes he has gotten a hold of a trustworthy witness and looks no further, or simply because there is a particular point he wants to make about the battle. In the case of Cyzicus, it might be that the Athenian commander Alcibiades, at least at this stage in his career, had luck on his side. But after the end of the war, and especially after the fall of the 30 tyrants, Xenophon's selectivity, as revealed by Diodorus's rival account, grows more and more quirky. There is less reassuring detail, such as the number of ships. There are more departures from strict chronological order. Xenophon's narrative in books 1 and 2 is a lot sketchier than Thucydides's, and does not inspire the confidence that Thucydides, rightly or wrongly, arouses in virtually every reader. But after book 2, it looks as if he wasn't really even trying to write the same sort of history. One example of this is the treatment of the animal sacrifices that Greek armies and navies customarily made before they set out from base and immediately before battle. Thucydides, a rationalist, hardly ever mentions these, and neither does Xenophon, up to the end of the Peloponnesian War, but thereafter, they are a recurring feature of Xenophon's military narratives, especially where the Spartans are concerned. And so it is that Xenophon follows Thucydides' precedent at the beginning of the Hellenica, but subsequently reverts to a more traditional attitude towards Greek religious practices. Xenophon's account of the Peloponnesian War differs from the rest of the Hellenica in another respect as well. There is a marked difference in one point of Greek style, which is one of those things that is intangible and doesn't come across in translation. Greek is, of course, a language that is very rich in words, especially words that connect little particles and words that give shades of meaning. And in almost all of Xenophon's work, including most of the Hellenica, he makes frequent use of these little words, these particles, these words that give shades of meaning and color. And then they include some favorites of his that are kind of characteristic of his style. However, the special favorites of his are absent from his account of the war, and indeed only a few of the shading words are found there at all. It may seem that when he writes about the war, Xenophon is perhaps imitating Thucydides' style, but even this explanation doesn't work because Thucydides' style is so very distinctive and so rich in abstract nouns and full of highly contorted sentences that it really is quite unlike Xenophon at this or any other part. In the later books of the Hellenica, including the account of the 30, Xenophon's writing is full of flavor. His style is flexible, subtle, and on occasions rich, and the speeches he writes are individual and almost always strongly differentiated from the surrounding narrative. But in his account of the Peloponnesian War, Xenophon writes with a flatter style, not differentiating between narrative and the principal speech, that of Euryptolemus in the debate on the 6 generals that I've just mentioned. Sometimes Xenophon's narrative is abbreviated and thin in detail, and in such cases, pepping it up with connecting and shading words might have been inappropriate or even incongruous, but some parts of the war narrative are quite full, and yet they employ very few connecting and shading words. What to make of this? It has been suggested that Euryptolemus's speech is written in the way that it is in order to make him sound sweetly reasonable. But there is no lack of connecting and shading words in other speeches from this period where the speechwriter wants to achieve this same effect. So I don't find that to be a very satisfying explanation. The explanation, long known, although not universally accepted, that is more likely is that Xenophon wrote the first part of the Hellenica much earlier than the rest. His account of the final years of the Peloponnesian War dates probably from the mid-380s, just after he wrote the Sinaiticus, which varies even more from his mature style. The rest of the Hellenica was written years later, some say over a long period of time, but more probably in roughly one go, sometime between 362 and 356. The dividing line between the early and late sections is not absolutely clear because the stylistic argument is a statistical one and not reliable for drawing precise lines. Before Book 2, Chapter 2, 23, we are in the early section for sure. After Book 2, Chapter 3, 11, we are in the later one. It is a certain point that the ancient division into books was different from the one used in medieval manuscripts and therefore in modern texts also. And this means that the indications from the late lexicographer Harpocration suggest that the end of summer book is in Book 2, Chapter 3, 9, and marks the original end of the first two books. But Book 239 is not written as though the author is about to put down his pen for years. So probably Xenophon originally stopped at Book 2, Chapter 223, with the bitterly ironic remark that the fall of Athens to the Spartans was believed at the time to herald the beginning of freedom for all Greece. This would be a strong ending. And roughly 30 years later, he wrote the rest, starting with the account of the dictatorship of the 30 that presumably constituted Book 3 in the scheme of the work as Xenophon left it. Then he came to join what he had written earlier with the newer material and added a short bridge passage forming the end of the original of Book 2 to fill in the few months between the fall of Athens and the institution of the 30. Presumably, Xenophon did not mean his readers to make anything much of the change in style. We've already noted that he carefully rewrote passages of the Agesilaus to make them suit their newer context in the Hellenica, but he evidently did not alter his account of the Peloponnesian War, except perhaps to add the short bridge passages that I've just referred to. He must have been satisfied with his original opening and thought it comparable in its aims and methods with the work of his older age. We may feel confident, therefore, that this selection and handling of material has moved further away from Thucydidean principles, and it seems that Xenophon did not sense any incongruity in this point. Well, what about the organization of the work as a whole? After Book 2, Chapter 3, 10, the Hellenica continues to be organized chronologically for the most part, rather than thematically or geographically. But it ceases to proceed annually, and it is often difficult to tell which year the narrative has reached. Xenophon deals at length with the deterioration and fall of the 30, which he himself witnessed, but passes over what was happening outside Athens at the time. Then the narrative shifts to Asia Minor, that is modern-day Turkey, and the fortunes of the Spartan army there, in effect following Xenophon's own life story, before doubling back at Book 3, Chapter 221 to fill in some incidents from the Peloponnese. Xenophon reverts to chronological order again for the years 396 to 394, but cuts back and forth between continental Greece and the Spartans in Asia Minor. Xenophon then gives the history of the Corinthian War in two separate chronological narratives. The first follows the war on the mainland, though after the outbreak of the war, He is virtually silent about its progress on Thebes' northern frontier. And the second describes the war at sea, which eventually becomes the sole narrative thread. There is, in the main, a single chronological line, therefore, from Book 5, Chapter 1, 25, which is the year 387, the lead-in to the King's Peace, to Book 7, Chapter 1, 32, that is the year 368, in the middle of the war in the Peloponnese that broke out after the Battle of Leuctra. Although at 2 points, Xenophon signals digressions in which he jumps forward in time to cover the history of Thessaly. This is in Book 6, chapters 1 through 4. Once we get to Book 7, 4, there is, again, a single chronological line from there to the end, tightly focused on the Peloponnese to the exclusion of important events in the Aegean and in Thessaly. Between Book 7, Chapter 1, and 1 through 4, the narrative is more complicated. From Book 7, Chapter 1, 33 to 40, it follows the Theban Peloponnesos to Asia and back again to tell the story of how he and Artaxerxes failed in their attempt to force peace terms on the warring Greeks in the year 367/366. And then in Book 7, Chapter 1, 41 through 43, we get a recounting of the campaign by Epaminondas in the Peloponnese that was in fact simultaneous with Peloponnes's negotiations, although Xenophon does not make this clear. In Book 7, 1, 44, Xenophon begins the story of Euphron, the autocrat of Sicyon, and although he doesn't say so, he is once again tacked backward in time by about 18 months. According to Xenophon, Euphron was a traitor successively to both Sparta and Thebes and loyal to no one. Into the middle of his story, Xenophon inserts, obviously as a deliberate contrast, a section, Book 7, Chapter 2, on the noble exploits of Phlius, a small city-state in the northeast Peloponnese that he depicts as outstandingly loyal to the Spartans. This section, Book 7, Chapter 2, recapitulates from the Phliasian point of view the whole of the first phase of the war in the Peloponnese, that is from years 370 to 366. So it is a thematic insertion, even though its internal arrangement is chronological. Then Xenophon returns to Euphron, and he tells us expressly in Book 7, Chapter 3, 4 through Chapter 4, 1, that he is allowing the end of Euphron's story to run on out of chronological order. So it's a complicated and, in some ways, almost garbled, one might say, organization. In quite a few places, Xenophon's narrative does not provide even information for us now to be sure exactly where we stand chronologically. But while this imprecision is irritating for historians today, it does not show that Xenophon had failed to work out the chronology for himself or to impose order over his material. Rather, although he uses chronology as his main organizational principle, he is not greatly interested in chronology, nor does he expect his readers to care about it, it seems. Even in the confusing passage that I've just talked about of Book 7, chapters 1 through 3, we should not imagine that Xenophon lost the plot. He recounts at length at Book 7, chapters 1 through 32 through 40, how Thebes and Persia failed to drive a wedge between the Spartans and their allies in the year 367 through 66. Then he tries, by using all the narrative tricks he can, to distract us from the fact that this failure was negated only a year later by the great diplomatic success that the Thebans had with the peace of 366/365, which he eventually and begrudgingly reports at Book 7, Chapter 4, 6 through 10. Even then, he leaves out the Persian involvement in this peace, just as in other places he minimizes the success of Persian influence over events in mainland Greece. For example, he omits the Persian role in promoting the peace of 375 through 374. Similarly, he leaves out Athenian participation in the peace of 366 to 365, presumably because he wanted to give the impression that the independence of Messenia could still be an open question for the Athenians even in the 350s. Therefore, he suppressed mention of the two occasions, that is 366 and 362. when they had formally recognized the new state. To make his case, he manipulated his narrative and omitted information that one might reasonably expect him to provide. And as I hope to show you, he is often tangentious, that is, biased in this way. Xenophon is well in control of the overall shape of his work. For example, he imposed a rigorous discipline upon himself for the years 365 to 62, narrowing the focus of the tale to the Peloponnese to make it natural to end with the Battle of Mantinea, in which his son died. In so doing, he ignored sequences of events such as the history of the Persian front, which would leave loose ends if truncated in 362. And both then and earlier, he carefully excluded almost all overt references to subsequent events. It is true that Hellenica may seem to end arbitrarily. To this point, then, let it be written by me, is what he says. Perhaps someone else will make subsequent events his concern. That is the final line. But in fact, Xenophon has worked hard to create a sense of closure to this narrative. Within Xenophon's basically chronological framework, however, the Hellenica does not give the impression of taut construction. On the contrary, the work is episodic. Much of it is written as a series of anecdotes, and conventional expectations of history do not explain why we are told a great deal about some incidents and little or nothing about others. For example, we have a long section in Book 3, Chapter 1, 16 through Chapter 2, 1, about one Dercyllidas, and who was the second Spartan general who campaigned in Asia in the 390s. Now, we read how, in this section, he cleverly played with a nasty piece of work named Medius, and how he took 9 cities, although villages might be more accurate, in 8 days. This campaign had little influence on the outcome of events, yet it is described in greater detail than anything else that the Spartan army did in Asia Minor in these years. Again, we are told at considerable length in Book 6, Chapter 2, 27 through 32, about the training methods that the Athenian general Iphicrates employed as he sailed his fleet toward Corcyra. The detail is piled on, even though Xenophon makes clear that the good training of Iphicrates' sailors made no difference to the result of his campaign, because the crucial Athenian success happened before he arrived. However, we are told nothing at all about Iphicrates' other technical military innovations, nor about the campaigns he undertook during the period covered by the Hellenica in Egypt, the Aegean, and Thrace. The anecdotes are, by and large, arranged chronologically and not just jumbled together, but they fall short of a narrative that has been drawn up on consistent historical principles and that seeks to reveal the connections between different events and the factors that lead to historical change. Was Xenophon then just incompetent? Well, 3 observations show that he was not. First of all, Xenophon casts his history predominantly in the form of anecdotes, so as to recreate the past vividly and to bring the dead to life, as it were, for future ages. This is one of the main purposes of his work. He is a master of dropping in a single concrete detail that calls up a whole scene before our eyes. One example of this phenomenon occurs in Book 4, Chapter 4, 5, when the young Corinthian aristocrats have taken refuge in a temple on a hill above the city as their elders are massacred. And as they deliberate about what to do next, the capital that is the kind of chief part of a column in the temple falls. We can imagine how startled the young men must have been in their overwrought condition. Again, in Book 6, Chapter 4, 36, we learn about the murder of Alexander of Pherae, which was organized by his wife. Xenophon conjures up the whole scene of the murder for us through the detail that while the assassins set about their work, his wife kept the door shut, gripping the handle. Elsewhere, to speed up his narrative, Xenophon uses fictional techniques such as conversation between people who are actually in 2 different places. This happens in Book 3, Chapter 4, 5, where the Spartan king Agesilaus and the Persian satrap Tissaphernes appear to talk to each other when they were in fact communicating from their respective bases. Or in Book 5, Chapter 4, 26, where another Spartan, Cleonymus, is depicted as talking to his father Sphodrius, although the latter, as had just been made clear, had fled from Sparta to avoid being punished for treason. Similarly, Xenophon makes longer stretches of narrative come alive by making us see events through the reactions of the individuals involved in them. The most elaborate example concerns a Spartan disaster in 390 at Lechaon, near Corinth. A Spartan detachment of heavily armed soldiers was caught in the open without any cavalry support and largely wiped out by Athenian light-armed troops and horsemen. The news of this defeat led Agesilaus, in command of the main Spartan army, to retreat to Sparta on the double, even though he had just captured the district of Peraion to the north of Corinth. Xenophon's narrative, this is now in Book 4, chapters 5, 6 through 17, first concentrates on Agesilaus, his pleasure in his initial victory, his handling of some ambassadors from his Boeotian enemies who have come to see him, and then a messenger arrives. His distraught state is painted in a few telling words, but we are kept in suspense as to the nature of his bad tidings until we have observed Agesilaus's reaction to the disaster and how he now deals with the ambassadors. However, Xenophon does not recount this incident in this way solely to maintain our suspense and enliven his narrative. We're also meant to note the uncertainty of fortune and how Agesilaus's reaction to it varies in appropriateness. Here as elsewhere, Agesilaus comes across as too pleased with himself in the hour of victory, and perhaps as arrogant toward the Boeotians. But he is also known to react swiftly, decisively, and with ready wit when there are problems. It is a less eulogistic portrait than that given in Xenophon's Agesilaus, which is virtually nothing but praise. But unlike the Agesilaus, the Hellenica makes the king live for us in a more vivid way, even now, more than 2,000 years later. Xenophon is also making historical points with a wider application when he shows us here Agesilaus's hatred of Thebes and his tendencies to overreach in times of success, but to be able to retrieve the situation in times of difficulty. The historical points embedded in this lively passage illustrate the second of the three observations that I mentioned a moment ago by means of offering a defense of Xenophon's competence. The second is that he often implicitly makes what one might call a historian's point, but he usually does so quietly and indirectly. There is an uncontroversial instance of this in another of his works, the Anabasis. At Anabasis, Book 2, Chapter 1-7, we learn how in the aftermath of the Battle of Cunaxa, King Artaxerxes sent a Greek in his service named Philinus to negotiate with the Greek mercenaries, including Xenophon himself, who had just fought against him. Now, an earlier historian whose work no longer exists, but we have some knowledge of this work, the man was named Ctesias, and we know that he was present at the Battle of Artaxerxes, as Artaxerxes' doctor, had written about how he accompanied Philinus on this mission. Xenophon writes that Philinus came alone. He does not mention Ctesias at all. And not only that, but he states that Philinus came alone. Now, this does not directly call Ctesias a liar, but since he had earlier cited Ctesias's account on how the rebel leader Cyrus had died, Xenophon himself was on another part of the battlefield when that happened, and so therefore had to quote a source for how it happened. Xenophon is not writing in ignorance of Ctesias's claim, you see. He knows the work, he knows what it said, and he does not expect his readers to be ignorant of this claim either. But by saying something that is contradictory to what Ctesias has said, he is putting Ctesias down, albeit quietly, but nevertheless effectively. The point was not lost on attentive readers, I think, in antiquity. And instances in the Hellenica of this same sort of one might say, polemical or historiographical approach that are corrective of earlier writers and other writers. Instances of this in the Hellenica are more controversial, but are also more important. In the year 395, for instance, Agesilaus marched east through Anatolia as far as Paphlagonia, and then turned back westward to the seat of the Persian satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia at Deuskalion. Now, we do have the Oxyrhynchus historian's account of this, as well as Xenophon's, and as so often, the two seem to be writing about two different sets of events, although in this case, they don't actually contradict each other, except trivially in that Xenophon calls the Paphlagonian king Otes, and the Oxyrhynchus historian calls him Gaius. The Oxyrhynchus historian's account, in fragments 24 through 25, includes many military details and bristles with names of strongholds that Agesilaus failed to capture. By contrast, Xenophon in Hellenica, Book 4, Chapter 1, 1 through 15, tells the charming and instructive stories of Agesilaus's relations with King Otes and with a rebellious local Persian nobleman named Spithridates, who married his daughter to Otes as a result of Agesilaus's machinations. One suggested explanation of this difference in treatment is to say that the Oxyrhynchus historian is hostile to Agesilaus and thus tells of his failures, whereas Xenophon's account is overly kind to him and concentrates on his successes. But the Oxyrhynchus historian usually, although not always, refers to Agesilaus's expeditionary force as simply the Greeks, and therefore implies that Agesilaus's cause is the cause of Greece and not just of Sparta. Whereas Xenophon shows how Agesilaus's diplomatic efforts ended in failure, since although he successfully brought Spithridates and Otes together, this triumph soon led thereafter to their jointly deserting Agesilaus when his chosen lieutenant, one Peripatus, managed to anger both of them by his officiousness. This is written about in Hellenica, Book 4, Chapter 1, 26 through 27. We should not think that Xenophon prefers to give us childish yarns rather than hard facts, thus displaying a distorted sense of what truly causes events, whereas the Oxyrhynchus historian austerely ignores such nonsense. Perhaps the Oxyrhynchus historian always preferred to concentrate on hard facts, but he would surely have had something to say about Otes' marriage to Spithridates' daughter had he known about it. So it would seem that Xenophon has used personal knowledge to fill in, at perhaps excessive length, but certainly in engaging style, a gap in the Oxyrhynchus historian's research. It is also of historical interest to show how Agesilaus manipulated people. More important still, by ignoring Agesilaus's attempts to storm minor fortresses and by writing at length about his relations with Spithridates and Otes, Xenophon implicitly suggests to readers who have digested the Oxyrhynchus historian, the work of the Oxyrhynchus historian, that he thought Agesilaus's crusade against King Artaxerxes was better pursued by diplomacy among the native princes rather than by purely military means, even if faults in execution meant that the diplomatic effort eventually failed. After Xenophon's death, things were different, but he was surely right to prefer the diplomatic approach in his own time. Agesilaus's most notable success in Asia, the Battle of Sardis, is another instance in which modern scholars have accused Xenophon of an inconsistent and slipshod approach when, in my view at least, he was implicitly and perhaps validly challenging the Oxyrhynchus historian's judgment of priorities. The Battle of Sardis was fought between Agesilaus and the troops of the Persian satrap Tissaphernes near the Persian city of Sardis in the summer of 395. According to the Oxyrhynchus historian in fragment 14, Agesilaus achieved victory in battle by means of a cunning infantry ambush. Some of the details are obscure because the papyrus of the Oxyrhynchus historian is in tatters in parts of this section. But to judge from the parallel passage of Diodorus Siculus in Book 14, Chapter 80, the Oxyrhynchus historian placed this ambush after Agesilaus had ravaged the suburbs of Sardis, although it is not clear whether it was set up to the west of Sardis or to the east. Xenophon, who was probably present at the battle and certainly in the general vicinity, instead writes at length about this. This is in Hellenica, Book 3, Chapter 4, 21 through 24. And he writes at length about a cavalry encounter in the open area near the banks of the Pactolus River before Agesilaus reached the suburbs of Sardis. Xenophon, therefore, and the Oxyrhynchus historian seem to be totally at odds, and it has been thought that their disagreement also extends to the routes followed by Agesilaus and the Persians into the plain of Sardis. Some of the explanation may be that we can read only part of the Oxyrhynchus historian's account, because there are 40 lines a little earlier in the relevant area of the papyrus where only a strip of about 8 letters wide survives. But the stray words that have been preserved in this strip suggest it was about Tissaphernes and Agesilaus and how they were maneuvering their respective armies. If the Oxyrhynchus historian did not think the cavalry battle by the Pactolus River was important, his account of it may have been brief and could have fit into this space. Indeed, there is a scrap of evidence that this is so, for we can work out that the Greek word for river, potamos, was written in the appropriate place. We are, however, still left with the fact that Xenophon does not tell us about the battle with the ambush, although that is what takes up most space in the Oxyrhynchus historian. Some modern scholars say that the Oxyrhynchus historian made it all up, but he gives the impression of being a conscientious and painstaking historian, as I've mentioned before. Others today say that Xenophon was a forgetful old man when he wrote his account of the campaign, or that he was absent and had not done his research properly, or even that he was sour about the great victory for one reason or another. But to my mind, it was not for any of these reasons that he was silent about the latter battle with the ambush. Rather, it was because the Oxyrhynchus historian had made so much of it in comparison with the earlier battle, and Xenophon wanted to redress this imbalance. As a cavalryman, what interested Xenophon primarily was the performance of the cavalry, and the first battle demonstrated the vital point that Greeks could defeat Persian cavalry, the enemy's strongest asset. Furthermore, that battle gave Agesilaus temporary control of the plain of Sardis. The cavalry played no part in the second battle, and although perhaps more people died in that battle and the Greeks gained as much or even more booty from it, it merely cleared the way for Agesilaus's return march. It was less strategically significant and held less of a lesson for the future. Xenophon disagrees with the Oxyrhynchus historian, not about the facts really, but about what mattered more. And again, on this occasion, Xenophon's point seems to have been a good one. But it is not just in these two cases, but in all the incidents that he recounts, in which Xenophon has some point or other in mind. At least we can see this after the Great Divide at in Book 2, Chapter 3:10. And it is certainly after this point that my third observation about his anecdotes comes to play, in that although the point is sometimes what we might expect from a historian, sometimes it is more like what one finds in a novel. To react appropriately, we need to be alert to the kinds of complexity that we more readily associate with novels. And this is really the kind of, the main purpose of our whole understanding of these historians from a historiographical perspective, from the perspective of writing about history and what sort of literary qualities they embellish, they use to embellish their texts. At Hellenica, Book 7, Chapter 2, Xenophon tells us that he wishes to display noble deeds, and thereupon he launches into a long passage on the courage and loyalty of the Phlacians, their equestrians, their cavalrymen, and this appears basically a recounting of their essential heroism. But Xenophon recognizes that nobility of character is often more complex. For instance, take the story of Anaximatus, the Spartan governor of Abydos in the year 389, who was killed in an ambush. This is written about in Hellenica, Book 4, Chapter 8, 35 through 39. There are many aspects to this anecdote. Xenophon shows that Anaximatus was careless about reconnoitering on the march, so one lesson is the need to take appropriate military precautions, a common theme of Xenophon's. But a second lesson concerns the Greek custom, whereby when an army marched out, sheep and other animals were sacrificed to read the future from the state of their innards. Xenophon emphasizes that Anaximatus ignored the omens, which were bad. They portended disaster. The entrails of the animals that he sacrificed portended very ill omens. So the story shows the importance of having due respect, it seems, for sacrificial omens, which is another common theme, and in fact, one might even say a fixation of Xenophon's. Thirdly, this is an episode in a feud, since in the Anabasis, Xenophon presents Anaximatus as having wronged him when they met in and around Byzantion in the year 400 BC, when Anaximatus was admiral, navarch of the Spartan army. It is also a brief polemic on Spartan politics, and Xenophon, at this point, just prior, in Book 4, Chapter 832, had told us that it was a result of improper or at least undue influence that Anaximatus obtained his command at Abydos at the expense of Xenophon's admired old friend Derasiladus. Xenophon intended us to find Anaximatus lacking in all these respects, but he also, and perhaps primarily, aimed to portray a brave man who inspired loyalty in his friends. When Anaximatus realizes that he has been trapped by the enemy, he fully accepts responsibility and the dictates of the Spartan code of honor, which require him not to turn in flight. At the same time, he tries to spare his friends by ordering them to leave and to get away safely. They disobeyed, and all fought and died together. So the story does not preach a simple moral lesson. Rather, it reveals that the final judgment on Anaximatus has to be a complex one. The most notorious instance in which Xenophon apparently treats his readers to a simple moral lesson is in Hellenica, Book 5, Chapter 3, 3 through 7, where the Spartan commander Telutius, who is a stepbrother of King Agesilaus, is killed during the siege of Olynthus because he loses his temper and chases the enemy cavalry too far. Xenophon then gives a short lecture on the importance of not losing one's temper, a point he pursues tastelessly, preaching over Telutius's corpse, as it were. Undoubtedly, he underlines the message about anger too vigorously here, which is, I would say, an unusual fault for him, because usually he does not state his views so explicitly, but lets them emerge more organically from his narrative and puts them into the mouth of a character or something like that. But the passage should be seen in context. Telutius has hitherto appeared to be a paragon of military virtue. His attention to morale, accessibility to his men, and sharing of their privations are emphasized. This is particularly seen in Book 5, Chapter 1, 13 through 17. And they are preceded by another rather over-the-top passage in Book 5, Chapter 1, 3 through 4, in which morale building is declared to be worthier of note than resources, dangers, or stratagems. Precisely because Xenophon had praised Telutius's good qualities so strongly, he is emphatic about his one weakness. Xenophon, therefore, is trying to make clear that Telutius's anger was not a unique slip by an otherwise ideal leader, but a serious flaw. Anger, Xenophon is trying to make clear that Telutius's anger was not a unique slip, but by an otherwise unique, ideal leader, but a serious flaw. Anger is a common trait among the senior Spartans, whom Xenophon depicts. At Hellenica, Book 6, Chapter 2, 19, the Spartan Mnassippus foolishly beats up his junior officers, and so his troops go into battle in a poor state of mind. Again, in the latter stages of the Peloponnesian War, uh, Callicratidas overreacts to being kept waiting by the Persian Cyrus. This is in Book 1, Chapter 6, 6 through 7. And Xenophon could be hinting at in Book 5, Chapter 3, 7, that the reason Spartans are addicted to outbursts of temper may be the high proportion of unfree people within Spartan society, whom upper-class Spartans can attack without restraint and kind of vent their spleen, as it were. Despite the fact that when praising Telutius in Book 5, Chapter 1, 3 through 4, Xenophon appears to deny that control of resources, personal courage, and tactical skill are important topics, he incorporates all three into his work. Perhaps he writes less about resource management in the Hellenica than about the other two, but there are several references to Athenian generals' problems in finding money to pay for rowers, for example, in Book 5, Chapter 4, 66, when he talks about Timotheus, or Book 6, Chapter 2, 37, when he talks about Iphicrates' solution. To illustrate how courage is a theme in the Hellenica, one need only refer again to the Phlasians and to Anaxagoras. Outside of battle, courage is shown by Socrates, and in the last hour by Theramenes. This is Book 2, Chapter 3, 56. As for tactical skill, good army leaders are masters of stratagems and know how to get out of difficulties, even those they have created themselves. In Book 6, Chapter 5, 16 through 21, Agesilaus skillfully extracts his army from a dangerous cul-de-sac into which he has unwittingly marched them. Although the original slip proves he is fallible, the main point of the story is his presence of mind and tactical ingenuity. Xenophon also underlines Epaminondas's novel tactics at the Battle of Mantinea as noteworthy, Book 7, Chapter 521. But while Xenophon rates tactical ability more highly than this passage of Book 5, Chapter 1 through 4 might suggest, he is consistent in regarding it as less important than creating good morale in the troops. In his other work, The Memorabilia, Book 3, Chapter 1, he had already stressed the unimportance of tactics as compared to morale. This is also one of the lessons of the tale of Mnassippus, whose violent anger so damaged his troops' morale that although he gave orders for a technical maneuver to enable them to deal with an unexpected attack, they could not carry it out and lost the battle. This is Book 6, Chapter 2, 21. So Mnassippus, like Telutius, came to disaster because he could not control his passions. The place of psychology in changing the course of battles is a central preoccupation for Xenophon, and something he emphasizes far more than do other ancient historians, perhaps because his personal military experience was especially great and varied. One of the main concerns of the anecdotes in Hellenica is leadership, as with the bad leader Mnassippus and the good but imperfect leader Telutius. It is also one of the main concerns throughout much of Xenophon's other writings. In the Anabasis, Book 1, Chapter 9, for instance, Cyrus receives a long and glowing obituary notice, emphasizing his positive qualities as a leader. Although the preceding narrative is more ambivalent, not disguising his carelessness before the Battle of Cunaxa and his rashness during it, in Cyropaedia, Xenophon shows us one very good leader in the person of Cyrus's namesake, the 6th century Persian king Cyrus the Elder. Some modern scholars see Xenophon as maintaining an aim so as to create a model of ideal leadership. But it is important to note that even Cyrus the Elder is not shown to be the ideal leader. He is not quite free from blemish militarily, and what is more important, cannot be intended as a model for Greeks in the civic institutions he sets up or maintains, such as the use of eunuchs. Nor can Xenophon have meant us to see his old general and patron Agesilaus as an ideal leader, because in Hellenica, Agesilaus makes the occasional slip. He is liable to be too pleased with himself, and he displays an element of, what we might call humbug in his makeup. The reason there is only praise for him in the Agesilaus is not because Xenophon thought there was nothing to blame, but only because he was writing an encomium, and the demands of the genre restricted him to just those things. Leadership itself is not a problem-free concept. Jason of Pherae in Hellenica, Book 6, Chapter 1, 5 through 6, and then again in Book 6, Chapter 1, 15 through 16, is declared to be an excellent military leader, dedicated to training his men and replete with ascetic virtues. He is also shown as gifted with diplomatic skill, and he does not exhibit either anger or the lusts of the flesh. Some scholars who see Xenophon as focused on ideal leadership take Jason to be one of his ideal or near-ideal leaders. However, Jason is not a model people should imitate generally, but rather a scoundrel who is struck down by the gods in his pride because of his impious intentions towards the wealth of the temple of Delphi. This is all laid out in Book 6, Chapter 4, 29 through 32. Nor is it necessary for a military force or a city to have a single leader. No one is named as the leader of the heroic Phlasians, and by nesting their story within the tale of Euphron of Sicyon, Xenophon implicitly contrasts their collective civic virtue with the way in which the people of Sicyon gladly accepted as their leader, and after his death, honored as their second founder, a man who in Xenophon's eyes was a mean-spirited traitor. Despite noting some of the advantages, therefore, and disadvantages of rule by strongmen in his Cyropaedia, Xenophon did not believe it to be the solution to the problems of Athens, Sparta, or even of the other Greek states more collectively. Casting his narrative in the form of anecdotes is not the only way in which Xenophon enlivens it. The speeches, he writes, also have that effect. Although Cratopus was an exception, as we've seen, composing extended speeches for historical figures was a standard technique among historians throughout antiquity. The speeches in Thucydides, for instance, had served largely as vehicles for the author's own analysis, and therefore the speakers in his work, though differentiated to some extent, all tend to speak in a style characteristic of Thucydides himself, and unlikely to accurately reflect how they themselves had really phrased their speeches. The function of speeches in the Hellenica of Xenophon is quite different. Xenophon aimed to depict the character of his speakers, partly by what they said, partly by skillfully differentiating the style in which they said it. Here are two examples of the technique. In Book 7, Chapter 1, 12, Cephisodotus takes the floor in the Athenian assembly. He is full of suspicion. He speaks in short, aggressive sentences. His dramatic presentation dominates the assembly. Also emphatic and aggressive is the extreme oligarch Critias, whose denunciation of his rival Theramenes in Book 2, Chapter 3, 24 through 34, bursts with forcefulness. Bear this in mind, he instructs the council brusquely. But Critias's speech is more complex than that of Cephisodotus. There is a much wider variety of sentence structure. Some of the sentences, that is, are quite unusual, with inversions in the natural order of clauses. In order to emphasize Critias's passion, on occasion beginning a sentence in one construction, another is substituted as it proceeds. Metaphors, poeticisms, unusual words, dignity-enhancing plural forms, and other devices of rhetoric heighten the solemnity and stateliness of the speech's richly wrought style. As from the vertiginous eyrie, the proud eagle suddenly swoops down on his prey. That is an example of taken directly from Xenophon's own work. It has been shown to correspond exactly to what ancient critics said was characteristic of Critias' style in works of his now lost. This is a great performance by Xenophon. Just as masterly also is the trio of speeches in Book 6, Chapter 3, 3 through 17, from the Athenian envoys to Sparta in the year 371. First comes the pompous Callias. He was hereditary torchbearer at the Eleusinian Mysteries, which were prestigious throughout Greece. So it is natural that he should try to impress the Spartans by referring to them, that is, to the mysteries, but he bungles his diplomatic effort by laying a too heavy emphasis on Athens as the universal source of Greece's wheat. Next, we hear the pungent Autocles, who seems to think insulting his hosts is the way to influence them, and cannot even make his insults accurate, since he misdescribes how the Peloponnesian League worked and harkens back to the way the Spartans had run their empire more than 30 years prior. Finally, despite these two false starts, the wily Callistratus smooths everything over and ingeniously puts the best possible gloss on what was actually a tricky strategic position for Athens. The most austere historian might have given space to two of these people. That is, Thucydides would have only given a kind of two of these speeches. Callistratus was a figure of the first importance, and there is reason to suppose he and Xenophon thought alike on many subjects. Autocles, no doubt, represented an important strand in Athenian opinion, besides being a foil to point up Callistratus's diplomatic skill. But it is tempting to suggest that the portrait of Callias was developed mainly for its own sake, and to record for future Athenians the humorous aspects of Callias, more precisely, if now in a less kindly manner, than Xenophon had done in his earlier work, the Symposium. In at least Callias's case, the depiction of character, therefore, is an end in and of itself. But speech is not just a tool in Xenophon's box of tricks. It is also itself a topic. Speech is slippery. Even in good cases, facts and arguments are liable to be twisted. Xenophon himself, in his Anabasis, Book 3, Chapter 2, 24 through 26, had dazzled the demoralized troops after Cunaxa, after their defeat at Cunaxa, with improbable comfort, saying that they should hurry home and tell their mates of the riches of Persia and the ease with which they could be obtained. An instance in Hellenica is the sophistry of the speech in which the assassin of the traitor Euphron defends himself in Book 7, Chapter 3, 7 through 11. Indeed, one might, with a little ingenuity, suggest that there is only one speech of any length in the whole of the Hellenica that does not contain at least one misstatement of fact or erroneous argument, and that is the Spartan prince Archidamus's exhortation to his troops before he leads them into battle in the year 368. This takes place in Hellenica, Book 7, Chapter 130, which does not contain any assertions of fact or argumentation at all. And also at Book 6, Chapter 3, 7 through 17, the apparently blunt and frank Autocles argues from partly false and partly anachronistic premises that Sparta's relations with her allies, while the excellent Callistratus pretends that Athens feels under no pressure from the great king, when in fact, as usual, Artaxerxes has indicated what he wanted to do, and no doubt threatened to intervene if he does not obtain it. The theme starts even before the Great Divide at Book 2, Chapter 3, 10, with the debate after the Battle of Arginousae, in which Euryptolemus argues that the assembly should arrange for the 6 Athenian generals before it be tried individually by a regular procedure, rather than moving immediately to a vote covering all of them. This is in Book 1, Chapter 7, 16 through 33. Undoubtedly, we are supposed to root for Euryptolemus in this debate almost as strongly as the Athenian mob clamored against him. But that does not stop Xenophon from depicting him as trying to manipulate the crowd with misleading or disingenuous arguments, even going so far as to say that 12 Athenian ships were lost in the battle. This is Book 1, Chapter 730, when the narrative has given the figure as 25 in Book 1, Chapter 634. It is another instance where Xenophon's message is not black and white. The archetypal tricky speaker was Theramenes, Critias's opponent in the time of the 30 tyrants. Critias taunts him for this and other double dealing by throwing in his face his nickname, the Slipper, because it fits both feet. In this crisis, Theramenes behaved heroically and met his death with spirit. Book 2, Chapter 356. But according to Xenophon, he had previously been a villain, plotting the downfall of the generals after the Battle of Arginousae. Now, in his final hour of heroic resistance, Xenophon has Theramenes give a vision of the Arginousae affair in Book 2, Chapter 335. That is at odds with Xenophon's own narrative of it in Book 1, Chapter 7, 3 through 6. Many have claimed that this shows that Xenophon separates the different scenes of his work in his own mind and colors each for maximum effect without regard to consequent contradictions. Now, Xenophon has probably exaggerated Theramenes' previous villainy, ignoring the role of misunderstanding and fearful self-defense in the Arginousae tragedy. And it may even be that the version of the affair that Theramenes gives here is closer to the truth than that of Xenophon's narrative, the latter being flawed by Xenophon's closeness to the situation and the passions it evoked. But it is one thing to criticize Xenophon's accuracy, and quite another to claim that his work is incoherent. Xenophon was not such an incompetent storyteller as to fail to see that his audience would remember when they read Book 2 what they had been told in Book 1. His point, right or wrong, is that even in Theramenes' most heroic hour, a genuinely heroic hour, he told lies. The thought occurs then, if speech is slippery and Xenophon depicts his younger self as speaking disingenuously, then what of the speech represented by the Hellenica itself? I doubt that Xenophon means to give us a subliminal warning about his own work, but the Hellenica is certainly slippery. For example, Xenophon makes a number of pronouncements through the work that apparently give his views on the scope and methods of history, thus to some extent making up for the absence of a formal preface, the kind that Thucydides made in the beginning of Book 1, Chapter 22 of his history. But there is something fishy in each case. At Hellenica, Book 2, Chapter 356, he records the dying witticism of Theramenes, and then adds, "Now, I am not unaware that these remarks are not worthy of record." End quote. It is a paradoxical way of giving emphasis. Perhaps the Oxyrhynchus historian, in his austerity, had omitted these remarks, and this is a dig at him. Then again, in Book 7 of the Hellenica, Chapter 2:1, Xenophon expressly contrasts his account of the Phlesians with how earlier historians had passed over the deeds of small cities. But in fact, earlier historians had generally not ignored small cities, and elsewhere Xenophon focuses rather relentlessly on Sparta and Athens, big cities, in other words, while other states appear by and large only in relation to those two. Xenophon, therefore, sounds as though he is announcing a new conception of history, but really he is simply justifying a digression. Similarly, when in Book 4, Chapter 8:1, he claims he will report only the important events in the Corinthian War at sea and pass over the rest, he is not signaling any great change in the criteria he had used in narrating the war on land, but is rather trying to head off criticism of the balance of his narrative. Perhaps he fears it will be judged to give undue space to just one of the Spartan commanders, to Lucius. A similar motive may be a factor behind the emphatic way in which, at Book 5, Chapter 1:4, he downgrades money, danger, and stratagems as compared to morale building. As we've already seen, the point is a genuine one, but it is being used as a smokescreen to deflect attention from the lack of proportion in the way he plugs to Lucius, while telling us much less than he might have about the deeds of the other naval commanders. It is not just in relation to these apparent methodological pronouncements that Xenophon may be seen as slippery. Indeed, while in antiquity Xenophon was considered a particularly fair-minded writer, we see, for example, in Lucian's work, Quomodo Historia conscribenda sit, how history should be written. 39, we see a reference to this idea of Xenophon being fair-minded. And also another fragmentary historian that only survives to us in fragments, that is Agatharchides, in his fragment 86, which is from his apparent book 1937, he says something similar about Xenophon being fair-minded. Even though that was his general reception in antiquity, moderns have generally taken the opposite view. That is, Xenophon is particularly prone to political bias and the grinding of axes. Well, the sound of axes being ground is perceived throughout the narrative, I think. It is, therefore, time to move away, in some ways, from the ancient perspective that Xenophon's general themes were always dealt with in a fair-minded way, and to consider whether he pushes any partisan theses on us. And what I would like to do in this regard is review, in turn, Xenophon's dislike of Thebes, his ambivalent stance towards Sparta and Athens, and his support of their so-called dual hegemony, and to examine also his attitude toward the great Pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia. But first, something he cared about more than any of these things, and that is the cavalry. As a cavalryman himself, Xenophon is a partisan of the cavalry, and he repeatedly emphasizes its role. We are told on many occasions that superiority in cavalry was vitally important to Persian control of the plans of Asia Minor, and that the Greeks would have to do better in this sphere if they were to prevail. Cavalry plays a major role in the triumphs of Agesilaus in Asia and in Thessaly. Here, especially when recounting the Thessalian skirmish in Book 4, Chapter 3, 4 through 9, Xenophon writes as if he has something to be personally proud about. And we may infer that he had trained Agesilaus's cavalry himself. Xenophon goes on to stress the place of cavalry in Lucius's early successes against Olynthus. That is in Book 5, 240 through 42, and Book 5, Chapter 3, 1 through 2. And although he generally plays down Theban successes where he can, he gives us details of a Theban cavalry victory in the year 378. That is in Book 5, Chapter 4, verses 44. Xenophon emphasizes the usefulness of cavalry against light-armed troops in the same passage, slightly further on. He applauds the prowess of Syracusan cavalrymen who come to help Sparta in the 360s. This is in Book 7, Chapter 1, 21. And of course, he praises the role of the Athenian cavalry at Mantinea in Book 7, Chapter 5, 15 through 17. It is no accident that the heroic Phlasians are cavalrymen. He also stresses the evil consequences that follow when commanders mismanage the cavalry, as did the Spartan commander at Lechion in Book 4, Chapter 5, 16, and the Athenian Iphicrates near Onion in 369, that is in Book 6, Chapter 5, 52. And he claims that having defective cavalry was a main cause of the overwhelming Spartan defeat at Leuctra this is mentioned in Book 6, Chapter 4, 10 through 11. Much more than any political or even moral thesis, if there is a single lesson Xenophon would like us to take away from his work, it is the value of good cavalry. Almost as strong and undiluted as his advocacy of the cavalry is his dislike of the Thebans, especially successful anti-Spartan Thebans. At Book 7, Chapter 5:12, his dislike bursts out openly when describing a minor setback the Thebans suffered in 362 BC. He sarcastically refers to, quote, these breathers of fire, these soldiers who had already defeated the Spartans, end quote. His bias appears also at Book 3, Chapter 5, 8 through 15, where he shows the Theban envoys to Athens in 395 to be deeply unpleasant people, They reveal their shiftiness by distorting the recent past when they imply that Sparta still maintains the oppressive garrisons and close oligarchies that Lysander installed around the Aegean in the years 404 to 403. Xenophon had pointed out in Book 3, Chapter 4, 2, that the Spartans had dissolved the close oligarchies, something that probably happened years earlier, around the time they withdrew support from the oligarchs at Athens. The only arguments the Thebans use are open appeals to naked self-interest, without any attempt to show the justice of their cause. They are so selfish that they do not realize that the Athenians might be, or at least might like to be thought to be, concerned with what is right. Xenophon's dislike of Thebans can be seen again in the opening campaigns of the Corinthian War. He draws a picture of the Thebans as swinging foolishly between extremes of hope and fear on the battlefield of Heliartus in the year 395. This is described in Book 3, Chapter 5, 20 through 24. And he insinuates that they showed cowardliness in their troop dispositions and timing the following year at the Battle of the Nemea River. This is Book 4, Chapter 218. Bias has also been seen in the fact that Xenophon does not name the Theban leaders Epaminondas and Pelopidas at the Battle of Leuctra, although this may be to stress the role of the gods in Sparta's defeat rather than to denigrate the men through whom they putatively worked. According to other sources, Pelopidas was a principal figure in the liberation of Thebes, although propaganda in hindsight may have inflated his role. Yet Xenophon does not name him either. He also suppresses Peloponnesian success against a detachment of Spartans at a battle near Tegira in northern Boeotia in the mid-370s. It can hardly be a coincidence that when Pelopidas is first named in Book 7, Chapter 133, he is toadying to the great king. Similarly, we are not given Epaminondas' name until Book 7, Chapter 144, when his third expedition to the Peloponnese backfires, although that really isn't his fault. Xenophon appears to treat Epaminondas more fairly in his account of the Mantinean campaign, when he praises his military preparations, boldness, training methods, and tactics. This is all in Book 7, Chapter 5. But the portrait is not quite as fair as it looks. Xenophon suggests it is only because desperate ambition made Epaminondas bring the enemy to battle at Mantinea, and that he outnumbered his opponents roughly 2-1, and his conduct does not require a psychological explanation. However, Xenophon's bias against the Thebans is not as ubiquitous as his advocacy of cavalry. While he shows bias towards the Thebans when he has cause to mention them, he does not look for occasions to castigate them. Indeed, he passes over some obvious opportunities to do so. He omits, for instance, various disaster-prone campaigns that Pelopidas waged in Thessaly in the 360s, which could have been used to make Pelopidas and Thebes in general look foolish. Xenophon also gives minimal details of Thebes's harsh treatment of Plataea and Thespiae in the year 373 in the course of the unification of Boeotia. And he does not even mention the destruction of Thebes' ancient Boeotian rival, Orchomenos, in 363, when he could easily have shown the Thebans as hateful. And it is clear that Xenophon had not always hated all Thebans, since in his youth he had a great friend named Proxenus, who was a Theban. He talks about this in his work, The Anabasis, Book 2, Chapter 110. It was this man whom he had followed into Cyrus's service in the year 401, and whom he commemorated in a dedication to Apollo at Delphi. Xenophon's bias against Thebes therefore arose, or at least grew, after 401 BC, presumably as a result of Thebes' actions in 395 against Sparta, and in 371 through 362 against Sparta and its Peloponnesian supporters. Xenophon's bias against Thebes thus implies that he was biased in favor of Sparta, and such a bias is what we might expect from someone who had fought for Sparta against his own city, Athens, who lived for 20 years as a Spartan client, and who wrote an encomium of a Spartan king. And he certainly displays straightforward support for other Spartan sympathizers and agents within the Peloponnese, men such as the Phlasian aristocrats and both Pasimilus of Corinth and Alcmenes, the men who let the Spartans into the long walls between Corinth and Lechion in the year 392. This he describes in his Hellenica 4, Book 4, Chapter 4:7. Open bias is on display in Book 7 elsewhere when Xenophon refers to the Peloponnesian opponents of Thebes as those who wanted what was best for the Peloponnese. This is in Book 7, Chapter 4:35. But of the Spartans themselves, Xenophon writes less wholeheartedly. We have already seen that he was ambivalent about them at the time when he drafted and then laid aside his constitution of the Lacedaemonians, probably in the 370s. That was shortly after Sparta had occupied the Theban citadel in the year 382, an act that the Hellenica denounces as impious and wicked in Book 5, Chapter 4:1. The constitution of the Lacedaemonians complains about the behavior of Spartan governors abroad. One recent example was that in 378, the Spartan governor of Thespia in Boeotia, the rash and incompetent Sphodrius, had made a sudden march on Athens at a time when the Athenians believed they were at peace with Sparta. In his Hellenica, Xenophon represents the subsequent acquittal of Sphodrius by the Spartan council as totally unjust, and this is in Book 5, Chapter 4:24. Throughout the Hellenica, unsatisfactory Spartans pop up. Xenophon could hardly have avoided mentioning some of them, such as Sphodrius, as I've just mentioned, and also King Cleombrotus, the loser at Leuctra, who is portrayed as generally useless throughout his Boeotian campaigns. And there are many others, such as Anaxibius and Benasopus, whom he could have easily left out or whose stories he could have told less garishly. An extreme example is his treatment of Thibron, twice sent out to Asia in the 390s. Xenophon depicts him as incompetent and implies that he was the passive homosexual partner of the strong flautist Thersander, something of that would be considered to be shameful among the Greeks. Even Xenophon's patron Agesilaus and Agesilaus's half-brother Telutius do not get unblemished write-ups, as I've already shown. Spartan error, Spartan unpopularity, and occasional disgrace are often on view, helping to give the Hellenica a sour tone, which Xenophon perhaps regarded as called for by the conventions of history. Still, the point can be overdrawn. Some modern scholars think that Xenophon not only objected to the Spartan occupation of the Theban citadel, but in common with many Greeks, also disapproved of Sparta's general behavior in the late 380s. In fact, Xenophon's criticisms are restricted to the occupation of the Theban citadel, and not to the latter point. According to Xenophon, this is in Book 5 of the Hellenica, Chapter 4:1, the divine plan behind what happened in Sparta in 371 and thereafter is revealed partly by the fact that Sparta's wickedness was punished by and only by the very people against whom it had been perpetrated, that is, the Thebans. By the logic of this argument, the Spartans had not been wicked in their actions during the 380s against Mantinea, Phleus, at that stage a democracy, and Olynthus. And although plenty of people did think those actions had been wicked, at least in the first two cases, Xenophon's account shows he meant exactly what he wrote in Hellenica Book 5, Chapter 4:1. It is true that he does not give us reasons against the view common in his day that the attack on Mantinea in 385 was a disgraceful breach of the just concluded king's peace, and ingenuity is required to imagine what defense he thought the Spartans had. But we must note his satisfied report in Book 5, Chapter 2:7 of the consequences of splitting the city into component villages, and his seeming astonishment in Book 6, Chapter 5:3, that the Mantineans supposed that the terms of the general peace that Sparta agreed to in 371 to 370 after Leuctra meant that they were now to be in every way autonomous. Xenophon thought the Spartans had acted perfectly appropriately in attacking Mantinea in 385 and splitting the city up. Also, it is plain that Xenophon shared the view that he attributes to the Spartan magistrates in Book 5, Chapter 3, 10 through 13, that the Peloponnesian democrats had been acting brazenly when they compelled their former exiles to litigate in the state's own courts, that the juries in those courts were composed of those who had committed the crimes, and that all in all, the Peloponnesians were behaving outrageously. Modern scholars have found it difficult to square Spartan intervention with the autonomy clause of the king's peace, but Xenophon did not. We may well shudder to be told that after the taking of Phlius, Sparta organized a court to decide who should live and who should die, described for us in Hellenica 5:3-25. But Xenophon regards it as an appropriate step in creating the splendidly loyal Phlius of the 360s, and he holds it up as an example of the Spartans' restraint and law-abiding nature, that when they packed the tribunal with their supporters, they did not choose only the former exiles. In the same way, he accepts at face value the justice of the show trial that convicted the Theban Ismenias in Book 5, Chapter 2, 35 through 36, writing as though it was significant that Ismenias failed to make any impression on the kangaroo court that the Spartans had assembled to gain their revenge for his part in the outbreak of the Corinthian War 13 years earlier. However, Xenophon's bias toward Sparta becomes even clearer if we consider what he omitted from the Hellenica, even when it lay fair and square in the path of the narrative. There are only faint glimmers of the ruthlessness and cruelty with which the Spartans behaved across the Aegean at the end of the Peloponnesian War. It is striking that Ephorus reported that Xenophon's old commander, Derkylidas, was a man of bestial savagery, something one could not guess from Xenophon's report of his activities. Characteristically, Xenophon does not defend Derkylidas against the accusation by argument or counterexample, but merely ignores the charge. Furthermore, except in the case of the 30 tyrants at Athens, Xenophon glosses over the evil of the narrow oligarchies and Spartan governorships that Lysander had set up around 405 to 404. He mentions them only in the sense that they are now over. This is referred to in Book 3, Chapter 4:2, and in Book 3, Chapter 5:13, giving no details. And the reason he introduces them is simply to demonstrate the unreliability of the Thebans, who tendentiously argue as if these repressive institutions are still continuing in that day of 395. Xenophon does not hide the fact that Spartan-led troops actively assisted the 30 in their depredations of, he mentions this Book 2, Chapter 3, 13 through 14, nor does he conceal that these troops also proved inadequate when put to the test against the rebel Democrats in Book 2, Chapter 4, 4 through 7. Nevertheless, he obscures Lysander's key role in setting up the 30 in the first place. Most modern scholars agree that after Athens surrendered to the Spartans and began to tear down the long walls in Book 2, Chapter 2, 23, as is described, 3 or 4 months passed before Lysander completed the work of destruction and forced the appointment of the 30. But this would not be guessed from the Hellenica. Contrary to the impression Xenophon gives, Athenian democracy was not the immediate casualty of military defeat. Lysander had to go out of his way to bring it to an end. Xenophon's obfuscation here is particularly noteworthy, as he could have used the Spartan role to absolve himself by making out that the moderate Athenian oligarchs were under duress from the outset. Even more significant Xenophon repeatedly avoids revealing the attitude of other Greeks to the liberation of Messenia from Spartan control in 369. He has to bend his narrative in striking ways to achieve this. For instance, in Book 6, Chapter 5, 51, he actually passes over the fact that when Epaminondas left Laconia during his first intervention in the Peloponnese, he went on to Messenia and freed it. Xenophon cannot have hoped to persuade readers then or later to forget the liberation. And indeed, we subsequently do hear of Messenians independent of Sparta. But by omitting the liberation in its proper place, he can avoid showing how most non-Spartan Peloponnesians gleefully assisted the Thebans in this task, and also how the Athenians, despite their alliance with the Spartans, stood back and let it happen. Xenophon, while not making clear what was going on in the south of the Peloponnese, complains at Book 6, Chapter 551, about the fact that the Athenian commander Iphicrates did not advance further than Corinth. Xenophon pretends that his complaint is on military grounds, implying that Iphicrates was not carrying out his instructions. But Iphicrates' inaction did him no harm at all in the eyes of the Athenian people, as soon afterward they gave him the plum command of the North Aegean. Later, Xenophon fails to tell us about Athenian involvement in the peace of 366 to 365, and brings his work to a close just short of the peace of 362/361. These failures are for the same reason as the omission in Book 6, Chapter 551. In both pieces, that is, both periods of peace treaties, the Athenians, along with the Greeks more generally, acknowledged the independence of Messenia. But the Spartans clung to the foolish hope that they could recover Messenia, and so evidently did Xenophon. It seems that he had little sympathy for the Messenian, or more broadly Laconian Helots, just as he regards as almost incomprehensible the veneration the serfs of Sicyon felt for Euphron, who liberated them a year or so later. From what he says approvingly in his Cyropaideia about the opportunities that, according to him, Cyrus the Elder gave to the Persian peasantry, Xenophon thought that the Spartans mishandled their own lower orders, but he shows more fellow feeling for the aspirations of Cnidon in his Hellenica, Book 3, Chapter 3, 4 through 11, who's only just the wrong side of the criteria for full citizenship of Sparta than he does for the truly oppressed. Xenophon does recount some Spartan failures, such as the Battle of Leuctra, and some unsatisfactory successes, such as the King's Peace. That was unavoidable if the story of these years was to be told at all, and does not show that he was being impartial. It is true that he could have avoided recounting the misdeeds of so many individual Spartans, but note that Xenophon tends to tell us about incompetence and personal weakness rather than about cruelty and financial dishonesty, the complaints we find in other sources. His criticisms of Spartans are those of an insider, the kind that the Spartans themselves would make of their fellows, and they are often presented so as to deflect criticism from the state of Sparta onto individual Spartans. For example, in recounting the acquittal of Sphodrius for his attack on Athens, Xenophon emphasizes a personal motive, namely Agesilaus's wish to further his own son's love affair with Sphodrius's son. We are not exposed to the Spartan government's reasons for thinking it was now useless to try to conciliate Athens by punishing Sphodrius, so pro-Spartan bias has indeed affected Xenophon's account of the period. Despite his criticisms of Spartan individuals, in his eyes, the Spartans collectively were the good guys. Occasionally, Xenophon seems to be so pro-Spartan so as to rejoice in Sparta's successes against Athens, his native city. With evident glee, he describes a surprise raid by Telutius's ships on the Athenian port of Piraeus during the Corinthian War. This is recounted in Book 5 of the Hellenica, Chapter 1, 19 through 24. It is hardly surprising to find Xenophon ambivalent about democratic Athens, especially when recounting a war between Athens and Sparta. After all, he had been a cavalryman in the service of an oligarchy in 404 to 403, and was in arms against Athens in 394. However, Xenophon, whether or not he returned to Athens in the 360s, did still think of himself as an Athenian, as he shows both in the Hipparchicus and throughout the Porroi. Nor was he a diehard oligarch. In his Memorabilia, Book 3, Chapter 5, Xenophon's Socrates argues against the younger Pericles' pessimism about Athens, saying that with various reforms, the city can again obtain the premier rank in Greece. The reforms he advocates do not include a change of regime, and he says nothing to imply that a democracy cannot achieve greatness. Indeed, in Xenophon's account of the events of 403, he shows that Thrasybulus and his democratic followers were right in their resistance to the 30 and in their subsequent struggle with the moderate oligarchs, who, backed by Xenophon's younger self, took power in the city of Athens when most of the 30 retired a few miles away to Eleusis. He handsomely acknowledges in Hellenica, Book 2, Chapter 4, 43, that the Democrats kept their word not to engage in reprisals after 403, although he does take a bit of the shine off of this by remarking in Book 3, Chapter 1, 4, that they were glad enough in the winter of 400 to 399 to send off the cavalry to Asia with Thibron, and rather hoped they would never return. It is true that he tries to show us that the city oligarchs had reasons for rejecting democracy and the democratic leaders, and he distances his youthful self from oligarchic atrocities, but he intends this to be taken not as an argument for the course of action he and the other moderate oligarchs pursued, but as an apology, that is, a defense for having made a mistake. Xenophon's treatment of Athens contains an omission that is almost as startling as his suppression of the liberation of Messenia. He says nothing about the foundation of the Second Athenian League in 378, and he studiously avoids a direct mention of it in Book 5, Chapter 4, 34. Indeed, it hardly appears as such thereafter. The Athenian League is named in Book 6, Chapter 319, and elsewhere. But although the League was consensual at the outset, Athens' most powerful allies came to regard it as oppressive. And so Xenophon's silence about it has been interpreted as a sign that he disapproved of Athenian imperialism, a parallel to his disapproval and his disapproving silence about the liberation of Messenia. Indeed, some set it as part of a more general case against imperialism, whoever the empire builders may be, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, or any other state. But this is to be, I think this is an overreading, even though it is true that in 355, probably a year later than the Hellenica was written, his Porroi condemned the Athenians' imperialistic ways and argued that they should try to lead the other Greeks not by the exercise of power, but through consensus building. By that time, Athens' collapse at the end of the social war meant that the game was up. One could be against imperialism in 355 without having opposed it a year earlier. This was probably true of most Athenians. Xenophon cannot have intended his Hellenica to be building a case against Athenian imperialism, since silence does not build a case. There was plenty he could have said about Athenian imperialism in the 360s, had he wanted to argue that such ventures always go wrong and lead to oppression and waste. But he conspicuously fails to mention the prime examples of Samos and Amphipolis. The latter is named only once, in Book 4, Chapter 3:1, in a context irrelevant in this connection. The one time when Xenophon shows an Athenian trying actively to build a trans-Aegean empire is the account of the final expedition of the Athenian general Thrasybulus, probably in the year 390. This is in Book 4, Chapter 8, 25 through 34. We learn from other sources that this was a bit of a shambles. Much of the fleet suffered a shipwreck in a storm. Thrasybulus seems to have imprudently allowed the enemy to gain the initiative on Rhodes, and there is evidence that his colleagues used strong-arm tactics on allied cities for personal gain. By the end, his colleagues were talking treasonably about resisting attempts to recall them to Athens to face trial. But from Xenophon, we hear only of Thrasybulus's successes until, out of the blue, disaster strikes at Aspendos in southern Asia Minor, and he is killed in a skirmish. Xenophon then comments that Thrasybulus had the reputation of being a good man. An odd obituary notice of Xenophon's real attitude was that Thrasybulus's imperialism was wicked and or otherwise unwise. Admittedly, Xenophon does not say that Thrasybulus actually was a good man, only that he had the reputation of being one. This is in Book 5, Chapter 831. But this need not hint at any doubt about the man's imperialistic policies. Xenophon may be reluctant to assert without qualification that Thrasybulus was good, because the gods are not supposed to let good men down. So Thrasybulus's unhappy end raises the question of whether, despite appearances, he had some hidden defect. It follows from Xenophon's treatment of Thrasybulus and his imperial venture that Xenophon cannot have been a principled anti-imperialist, and principled anti-imperialism is not the reason he has little to say about the Second Athenian League. This conclusion is supported if we turn from this Athenian attempt at empire building to the more successful imperialistic efforts of Sparta. Xenophon never breathes a word against Spartan control of the Peloponnese, nor, as we have already seen, does he draw conclusions from Sparta's violence and cruelty in the late 400s. At least in his Hellenica, Xenophon does not write about the moral corruption that Ephorus and other historians in the late 4th century saw as flowing from the influx of imperial profits into Laconia. Xenophon rather attacks particular instances of Spartan aggression rather than Sparta's general aggressiveness. He does attack the belligerence of Sparta's enemies, such as the Thebans, but this is not evidence of generalized anti-imperialism, as distinct from antipathy to aggression from the wrong side. Though Xenophon was not opposed to imperialism as such, he had other reasons to disapprove of the Second Athenian League. It was expressly advertised in 377 as an anti-Spartan league. Its resources were key to bringing about the peace of 375 to 374, which was a diplomatic defeat for Sparta, and the Athenians' preoccupation with the Aegean affairs of the 360s will have been seen by Xenophon as distracting them from their proper task of bolstering Sparta in the Peloponnese. Perhaps this is why he says so little about it. That Athens and Sparta had fought the Peloponnesian and Corinthian wars against each other could not have been passed over. But from 386 onwards, Xenophon emphasizes as much as possible the occasions on which the two worked together and plays down the extent to which their long-term interests were opposed. Therefore, the space given to the two speeches allegedly made by Procles the Phlegian in early 369 can be understood. In the first place, that is in Book 6, Chapter 5, 38 through 48, Procles urges Athens to come to Sparta's aid against the first Theban invasion of the Peloponnese, while in the second, that is in Book 7, Chapter 1, 2 through 11, he advocates that they should share the command, Sparta to lead by land and Athens by sea. This has rightly suggested to many that Xenophon favored what is sometimes called dual hegemony, in which the leadership of Greece was to be shared by the two cities between which he had split his loyalties, with Sparta dominant on land and Athens at sea. But it is not at all plain sailing here. Procles is perhaps somewhat naive, and if Xenophon were wholehearted about the second speech, it is odd that no harm is shown to come from its rejection in favor of a seemingly impracticable notion of combining the command of both land and sea forces, but then alternating it between the two powers every 5 days. Something does indeed go wrong. The Thebans are let through the pass at Oeneon, by Spartan carelessness and pusillanimity in Book 7, Chapter 1, 15 through 17. However, the alternating command had nothing to do with this lapse, and as it was, according to Xenophon, entirely the Spartans' fault, it hardly supports giving Sparta permanent overall command on land. Furthermore, Xenophon is distinctly sour about the peace of 375-374, though, as we are told by a Roman author, Cornelius Nepos, in his Life of Timotheus, chapter 2, section 2, whose work often follows Ephorus, I might add, this peace expressly incorporated dual hegemony. It would seem that any sentiments Xenophon had in favor of joint Spartan-Athenian leadership were outweighed here by his dislike of the benefits that the peace brought for Thebes, and possibly by distaste for the Persians' role in promoting the peace, a role suppressed by Xenophon at Book 6, Chapter 2, 1, but revealed by the efferent sources such as Diodorus Siculus in Book 15, Chapter 38. Xenophon is much more enthusiastic about the peace of 372-371, where Sparta was again clearly in control, but instead of the harsh sentiments imposed in 404 and 386, now sought Athenian cooperation. Still, Xenophon would doubtless have voted for dual hegemony in the 350s if it could have been achieved. But then, of course, it was a pipe dream. But he hardly wrote the Hellenica as a tract to advocate it. There was a related notion that the Greeks, united under their leaders, should embark on a great pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia, a theme on which the tiresome Isocrates preached interminably for half a century. It was natural to think that Xenophon, an old campaigner against Artaxerxes, would favor this idea and would draw the same lesson as did Isocrates from the March of the 10,000 and the Asian expedition of Agesilaus, that it would be essentially a piece of cake to defeat the Persians and to wrest Asia Minor away from them. Xenophon shows clear hostility to the Persians and to Artaxerxes in particular, in his Agesilaus and in the last chapter of the Cyropaideia. Even in the Hellenica, he is gleeful at the humiliating, if probably temporary, failure of Artaxerxes' diplomacy in 367 to 366, which is recounted for us in Book 7 of the Hellenica, chapter 1, 37 through 40. However, Xenophon cannot have been completely anti-Persian, for much of the Cyropaideia advocates, allegedly, for Persian practices, and plenty of passages elsewhere show some sympathy for Persian ways and for individual Persians. The Persians were, after all, fine cavalrymen, and we've already seen that that was a preoccupation of Xenophon. Although Xenophon fought against the Persian Pharnabazos, both when he was in the Athenian army and when he was in the Spartan army, he consistently depicts him favorably, offering at Hellenica Book 1, Chapter 1, 6, a heroic vignette of him riding his horse into the sea to support his allies, and describing at length in Book 4, Chapter 1, 29 through 38, how he remonstrated with Agesilaus for ingratitude in a story that shows Pharnabazos in the best possible light. It is, in fact, remarkably difficult to find passages unambiguously showing Xenophon in tune with Isocrates' war drum thumping for the great crusade against Persia. Xenophon does beat the drum in his Agesilaus, but if Agesilaus had hated barbarians and longed for such a great crusade, or even if that was merely what the Greek world thought he should have done, then his encomiast had to follow suit. So Agesilaus proves nothing about Xenophon's personal convictions. In his Hellenica, Xenophon depicts Jason of Pherae as hinting, this is in Book 6, Chapter 112, that he intends to go on such a crusade. But what one thinks of these hints depends entirely upon what one thinks of Jason. Xenophon plays down Persia's ability to exert pressure on the mainland Greek states, omitting or minimizing it in his accounts of at least 3 multi-party pieces, probably in part because he was ashamed of Persia's dominating role. But that does not show that he wanted the Greeks to retaliate aggressively. In his Anabasis, Book 3, Chapter 2, 24 through 26, Xenophon depicts himself bucking up the spirits of the troops after Cunaxa by stressing Persian weakness. And as I've already noted, this seems as much designed to show Xenophon's facility in argument as to convince the reader. The best evidence, therefore, for Xenophon's crusading spirit is that he shows not only Agesilaus, but also his opponent Tethraustes, as believing that Agesilaus had excellent prospects in Asia had he not been stabbed in the back by the Thebans. This is in Agesilaus, Book 3, Chapter 5, 1. But even here, Xenophon does not absolutely commit himself to agreeing. Still, probably he did think that victory in the Great Crusade was achievable, if only Greece were united behind the effort. What about the role of the gods inside of Xenophon's Hellenica? In 5 of the 6 cases that we've just examined, Xenophon proves on close examination to be less of a vigorous partisan for a simplistic view than has sometimes been supposed. However, there has been one dearly held thesis that Xenophon is keen to press in his Hellenica, and that is the belief that despite the misfortunes of good people, the gods are just and beneficent. This is a thesis that sort of permeates his entire work. For many religious-minded Greeks, the misfortune of good people did not create a great problem because they saw the gods as arbitrary and prone to envy, as they often appear, for example, in Herodotus, to say nothing, of course, of mythology. There were also a few rationalists, as we've noted, Thucydides is one among them, who did not regard the injustice of fortune as a problem because for them, the gods are removed, in a sense, at least from the narrative of their history. They don't seem to take a direct role in human affairs. But Xenophon's attitude differed from both groups. He was imbued with religious rationalism, shared by his own account with Socrates. This led him to believe in the divine ordering of this world according to just principles, a creed that is bleak for most people, except for the most successful, and is certainly a difficult challenge for one's heroes when they fail. So it was a problem that had to be worked out for Xenophon, and especially considering how Socrates came to such a bad end, condemned to death by the Athenian courts and made to drink poisonous hemlock like he was a criminal. And Xenophon succeeded in solving this problem, at least to his own satisfaction, and at least in terms of Socrates' case, but only by stretching the truth, common enough in Socratic writings. Plato's Apology had shown Socrates as prepared to risk irritating his jury and as refusing to compromise his beliefs and integrity. But Xenophon's apology went further. Xenophon Socrates decides before the trial starts that death is preferable to old age, a view Plato Socrates also reaches, but only once his execution has become inevitable. And Xenophon implausibly depicts him as, in effect, provoking the court so as to convict him and sentence him to death, and therefore spare him of the miseries of old age. And so, according to Xenophon, the gods gave Socrates what he actually wanted all along. So there's a kind of neat way out of the problem. But only a few years after Xenophon composed the Apology, his problem recurred. As we've already noted, despite faults in individuals, the Spartans were collectively the good guys in Xenophon's eyes. But at the Battle of Leuctra, they suffered a grievous defeat. Xenophon had to find reasons why the gods let Sparta down, and he identifies 2, and only 2, key Spartan sins. First of all, in Hellenica 5, chapter 4, 1, he denounces the treachery involved in Sparta's occupation of the Theban Acropolis, the Cadmea, in 382, the citadel. Subsequently, in Book 6, chapter 4, 2 through 3, he complains that after Sparta had neutralized Thebes' former ally Athens in the peace of 372 to 71, The Spartan assembly decided to proceed directly against Thebes without going through the rigmarole of disbanding the army and repeating for form's sake the demand that Thebes should respect the autonomy of the other Boeotian cities. Xenophon implies by this that this was a breach of Sparta's oaths under the peace treaty. But while others besides Xenophon were indignant about the events of 382, his protestations in Book 6, Chapter 4, 2 through 3 are artificial. For Sparta's behavior in 371 was perfectly reasonable and no doubt anticipated among all of those who had sworn to the peace. Most people would not have needed recourse to the assembly that met just before Leuctra to find plenty of instances of Spartan injustice, arrogance, and disregard for oaths in the preceding 30 or so years. To make such a fuss about this final incident showed the strength of Xenophon's devotion to Sparta and his rather odd brand of legalistic piety. He was, in a sense, finding excuses for the gods. Although Xenophon gives the gods an important role in his history, he does not allow his belief in divine causation to stop him from exploring the human causes of the same events. On the theological level, the sins of the Spartans are the cause of their defeat at Leuctra. But he still explains to us that the Spartans were defeated because their commander was overly hasty, their officers were drunk, and their cavalry was in very bad shape. This is all in Book 6, Chapter 4, 6 through 11. One can argue about whether Xenophon was right to suggest that the Corinthian War was caused by Persian gold, Theban plots, and Spartan errors of judgment, as he says in Book 3, Chapter 5, 1 through 16. But these causes are secular and reasonable enough. Herodotus tells many tales of the gods' miraculous intervention in human affairs. But for Xenophon, there are no clear instances of this. At most, the gods inflame the courage of one set of soldiers, or achieve the results they want by operating on the morale of both sides. This is all in Book 7, Chapters 4 through 5. They act through human psychology and natural processes, such as the clap of thunder just before a notable Spartan victory against odds in 368, talked about in Book 7, Chapter 1. No supernatural event is needed for the gods to exact retribution for the impious murder of pro-Spartan Corinthians. Justice is done when the killers are bloodily slaughtered in their turn by the sons of those whom they have slain, in Book 4, Chapter 4. The gods do not have to intervene miraculously so as to punish Anaxibius. The same careless attitude that led him to ignore bad sacrificial omens also leads him to take inadequate military precautions in Book 4, Chapter 8, 35 through 39. But it is not just on rare and marginal occasions that the gods show their concern for the righteous. Xenophon sees them as actively shaping the balance of forces within the Peloponnese throughout the 360s, from whom he implicitly draws comfort at Book 7, Chapter 5, 13, when they argue and regard themselves as having punished Sparta enough. At any rate, it is not for human beings to presume to act in the god's stead, as the Oracle of Delphi informs inquirers, worried about the plans of Jason of Pherae, that the god can look after himself, Book 6, Chapter 430. This revelation is surely included in the Hellenica so as to warn people who shared Xenophon's distaste for the events of 382, not to react by supporting the Thebans' use of religious charges against Sparta in 357, the fuse that led to the explosion of the sacred war. As was mentioned earlier in the connection with Anaxibius, the Greeks were accustomed to offering animal sacrifices before leading the army into action and to inspecting the victim's internal organs, especially the liver, by the state of which they thought one could tell whether it was right to proceed. Xenophon was a firm believer in this practice, so fecklessly scorned by Anaxibius, and used it as an example of the gods' beneficence toward mankind. Greeks might also carry out such divinatory sacrifices on other occasions when seeking counsel. For example, on the long march of the 10,000, Xenophon sacrificed to see the gods' opinion on whether he should stand for election as supreme army commander, and also whether he should persuade the army to establish a permanent settlement on the coast of the Black Sea. This practice should have challenged reflective believers, since when two Greek armies prepared to do battle, both performed animal sacrifices and both generally received good omens. At any rate, if the commanders continued sacrificing long enough, they would have no doubt gotten the proper liver that they were searching for. Yet one side would always go on to lose the battle. Xenophon is eager to tell us of the many occasions when the gods correctly predicted the outcome, usually giving good omens to Spartan victors, occasionally giving bad omens that were ignored at the commander's peril, as they were by Anaxibius. Xenophon underscores the Spartans' piety by persistently reporting the sacrifices they offered before crossing their frontiers, a Spartan practice that Thucydides simply ignored. But Xenophon never shows an army sacrificing successfully before a battle in which they proceed to lose. The Spartans are never shown sacrificing before Leuctra, although presumably they would have. Otherwise, surely Xenophon would have made Cleombrotus's impious arrogance as plain as he had Anaxibius's. And Xenophon strongly insinuates that the Thebans were lying about their sacrifices before their defeat at the Nemea River in 394. This is mentioned in Book 4, Chapter 218. There's only one apparent exception to the rule that sacrifices, if reported, are always shown as revealing the truth, and this is, we were told in Book 3, Chapter 5-7, regarding the favorable omens that the Spartan king Pausanias received when he crossed the frontier in 395 on his way to join Lysander at Haliartus. And interestingly enough, the upshot of that was that Lysander was killed, and King Pausanias was blamed for this and subsequently banished. Against the background of Xenophon's pious fiction that sacrifice never produces error, this cannot be meant to be an exception. Rather, it confirms the impression that one gets from the narrative of the failed campaign, namely that Lysander was responsible for his own mishap. And we should note that the sacrifices he would have made are not recorded, and that King Pausanias was harshly treated by the Spartan authorities. Xenophon's handling of this topic says much for his piety and his subtlety as a narrator. However, it says little about his intellectual honesty, because although he avoids outright lies, this is another instance of slipperiness. What about Xenophon's sources? Herodotus and Thucydides spent many years traveling the Greek world, searching out accounts of the events that they wished to record. But it was not so for Xenophon. He followed Thucydides rather than Herodotus in virtually abstaining from discussion of his sources. But he did not develop the habit of research that justified Thucydides' air of authority. This does not mean that his work is all hearsay at third or fourth hand, though a likely example of this is his account of the murder of Alexander of Pherae, which we read about in Hellenica, Book 6, Chapter 4, 25 through 37, in the course of a digression on Thessaly. Xenophon in general probably reported the tales of eyewitnesses directly or only at one remove, but it looks as though he usually waited until testimony on an incident presented itself and did not cross-check it with other witnesses, much less did he attempt to interrogate competing accounts on the same event. Among Xenophon's main sources were, of course, his own memories. That is obvious for the story of the Spartans in Asia in the early 390s and their return to mainland Greece. Although even here, what he tells us may go beyond what he himself saw and take in what fellow soldiers told him at the time. His own memories were, no doubt, also the main source of his account of the 30, with its special emphasis on the role of the cavalry in which Xenophon must have served. And as I've said earlier, the overly detailed narrative of Thrasylus's expedition to Western Asia Minor in the latter years of the Peloponnesian War probably reflects Xenophon's own participation in it and his vivid memories of his own first campaign. There may well be other examples where the Hellenica is reporting events at which Xenophon himself was present, but we should not see the Hellenica as a disguised form of autobiography, as the Anabasis was. Xenophon conspicuously fails to tell us about his expulsion from Scylla, his dramatic and emblematic, this is a dramatic and emblematic event, and it would have been worth the retelling. And conversely, he recounts many things that he cannot possibly have seen himself. Not only events in Europe when he was in Asia, but also naval campaigns in the Corinthian War, Athenian expeditions to the west, and so on. So he must have used stories from other people too, but he did so only, he did not go looking for them. Scylla was a convenient rendezvous close to Olympia, where Pan-Hellenic games were celebrated every 4 years, and the temple precinct was a constant magnet for tourists. There would be a steady flow of reminiscing friends to receive Xenophon's hospitality. Several people are named or given space in the Hellenica beyond the needs of either a lively narrative or a measured history. Some of these citations seem to be Xenophon's way of thanking his friends, perhaps specifically for their information. Although Passimilus of Corinth's adventures in 392 are recounted in Hellenica Book 4, Chapter 4, 4 through 12, they were objectively important, and so much so that Xenophon troubles to tell us this at Book 7, Chapter 3, 2, that Passimilus witnessed Euphron's machinations at Sicyon, and this seems more like an acknowledgement than anything else. Procles of Phlius was probably another close associate of Xenophon's. That would explain why he has given not just one, but 2 speeches in favor of cooperation between Athens and Sparta, among the many that must have been made on those occasions. Although Procles is named only once in connection with events at Phlius, he might well be the origin of much or all of the praise of the Phliasians, which is talked about in Book 7, Chapter 2. But the most striking example of giving a friend a lot of space comes in Book 1, Chapter 3, 13, when Xenophon tells us about an Athenian embassy to Persia with an amount of detail that is excessive. Again, excessive vis-a-vis the general scale of the narrative, given that the embassy was completely abortive. This is reminiscent of the detail he gives about Thrasylus's expedition, and it suggests that Xenophon included it out of personal regard for the source, who was often thought to be Euryptolemus, one of the ambassadors. Since it is probably this Euryptolemus who is mentioned as having welcomed his kinsman Alcibiades on his return to Athens from exile, flush with the laurels of his victory, and whose brave speech gets so much space in the account of the 6 generals arrested after Arginousae. That is why it is oftentimes traditionally attributed to Euryptolemus. These 3 friends may have contributed even where they are not named. For example, it could have been Euryptolemus again who told Xenophon about the Battle of Cyzicus. It is also not easy to suggest other personal connections behind stories. As I've said earlier, Xenophon's slant on the Battle of Dardanus and Abydos in Book 1, Chapter 1, 2 through 7. This may have come from Dorieus, one of the participants, or from someone in his squadron. And Xenophon's version of the Battle of Aegospotamoi in Book 2, Chapter 1, 20 through 32, sounds suspiciously like what would have been said in his own defense by Adamantus, an Athenian general who was captured by the enemy during the battle, but unlike his fellow generals, was released unharmed. Using friends as sources should not be dismissed as mere chumminess. Xenophon recognized that historians should report only what they had good evidence for, and perhaps for that reason he confined himself to what he had been told by witnesses whom he had personal reasons to trust. In the absence of a great deal of work by the 350s, when the Hellenica was written, it is unfair to demand of a man probably in his 70s. He could hardly have avoided this restriction. Unfortunately, however, even eyewitness evidence is problematic, as Xenophon should have learned from Thucydides in his statement in Book 1, Chapter 22 of his Histories. Eyewitnesses may have limited perspectives or reasons for deceit, and trusting his friends sometimes led Xenophon into error. An example of this is the account given in Book 6, Chapter 2-3, of the events that followed the peace of 375-374. On his way home after the peace had been declared, the Athenian general in the west, Timotheus, intervenes in Zakynthos, in what, according to Xenophon, the Spartans immediately determined was a provocation. Xenophon says that the Spartans then prepared a fleet and sent it out under Mnaesippus. But no one now questions that Diodorus was right, as he says, about what he says in Book 15, Chapter 45 onwards, to say that first the Spartans had sent two smaller naval expeditions to the west under Aristocrates and Alcidas. Xenophon has left out a year. Diodorus goes on to say in Book 15, Chapter 47, that Mnaesippus sailed out only after the Spartans had observed that Athens's response in the west had gone adrift, since Timotheus, although instructed to return there, had instead sailed around the North Aegean looking for money and men. Xenophon's account is again different in Book 6, Chapter 2, 11-13. There he has Mnaesippus set out before Timotheus, and thus he makes Timotheus out to be a fool who sailed northeast when he knew that the enemy fleet had sailed west. There too, although now we are entering the realm of controversy, it seems both from what is likely in itself and from other evidence that Xenophon is wrong. However, Xenophon, in what follows, is accurate enough. Timotheus was deposed from command, and his fellow Athenian politicians, Iphicrates and Callistratus, took over the fleet and sailed to the west, only to find that Mnaesippus had already been defeated and killed. It is therefore instructive to ponder the probable origin of these errors, which are unlikely to be innocent slips. Someone tendentiously abbreviated the events of 375 to 373 and placed some of them in the wrong order. But it probably was not Xenophon himself, since his story runs counter to his natural bias. In his account, the Spartans seemed to react hastily and aggressively to the initial alleged provocation in 375-374. In fact, their initial response, although bad-tempered, was proportionate. Mnaesippus's subsequent expedition, however badly implemented, could have been presented as a sensible reaction to the developing situation in 373, when the Spartans recognized they had a narrow window of opportunity to strike in the west before Timotheus could get his fleet together. But it is not difficult to identify the sort of person who would have had a motive to bend the facts, as Hellenica does, namely someone interested in blackening Timotheus's reputation. Thus, Xenophon's source made out that the collapse of the peace of 375-374 was simply due to Timotheus's actions on Zakynthos in the winter of 375 to 374, and that his preparations in 373 to meet the Spartan reaction were not merely prolonged, but totally inept. Something else seems fishy around here, too, for despite the impression that Xenophon gives, Iphicrates and Callistratus had not been speedy to discharge their commission. And again, contrary to Xenophon, in Book 6, Chapter 239, their joint voyage was not a striking example of enemies sinking their differences, burying their differences. They had kept the fleet in Athens while they together prosecuted Timotheus, who was acquitted. So all in all, it seems likely that someone motivated by Athenian internal politics told Xenophon a deceitful tale. It is less significant to give a name to this deceitful source, but it seems that Callistratus is as good of a suspect as any. Into this Athenian material, Xenophon inserted what he had learned about the faults of Mnaesippus, presumably from Spartan acquaintances but it seems he failed to cross-check his sources by questioning his Spartan friends further about the background, as they would have been bound to tell him about Aristocrates and Alcidas, and one supposes Xenophon would not then have implied that Mnasippus was sent out immediately after Timotheus's act of provocation. So what we have here is not research, but uncritical interweaving of tales from two sets of friends. Still, it is possible to go too far in terms of how little research Xenophon did and how inadequately he responded to evidence or the lack of it. He claims in Book 6, Chapter 413, that the Spartans held their own for some time in the Battle of Leuctra, but he does not assert that this is a plain fact. He gives a ground for it that they managed to carry off the dead body of King Cleombrotus, thus showing that it is an inference that one can draw. This suggests that elsewhere, where he does not give grounds, he believes that he has direct evidence. And as I've said before, for instance, at Hellenica, Book 4, Chapter 6, 4 through 12, Xenophon corrected the version of Agesilaus's Acarnanian campaign of 389 that he had given in Agesilaus 220, presumably because an earlier reader told him he was wrong and supplied the relevant detail. He gives many numbers for the size of fleets in the Peloponnesian War, and these inspire confidence. The variations with Diodorus's numbers show Xenophon did not derive them from the Oxyrhynchus historian, and on the whole, they seem more satisfactory than those in Diodorus. Conceivably, Xenophon may have consulted only one eyewitness, perhaps Euryptolemus, to get these numbers. But as Euryptolemus, or whoever it was, had no need to include them to make a good story, Xenophon presumably had to question him further to elicit them. Likewise, there are details in the account of Thrasybulus's last expedition in 390 that go far beyond the needs of the story. Furthermore, it seems likely that Xenophon made a special effort to find out what really happened when his son died at the Battle of Mantinea, and up to a point to give the enemy his doom. His account is clearly superior to that of Callisthenes, the next historian to describe the events of 386 to 362, whose version of Epaminondas's marches to and from Sparta before the battle is logistically impossible. Nor, to judge from Diodorus Siculus's Book 15, chapters 82 through 87, was Ephorus's subsequent account much better, though, as often, Diodorus seems to have added blunders of his own. For instance, Ephorus seems to have taken Callisthenes' account of Epaminondas's march and modified it only to the minimum extent required to make it barely feasible. The great 2nd century historian Polybius tells us that Ephorus was wholly inexperienced in land battles, and in particular had written nonsense about Leuctra and Mantinea. Polybius, by contrast, was a soldier, as was, of course, Xenophon. So this all brings us to the question of Xenophon's trustworthiness. And as we have seen, although Xenophon sometimes makes mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes may be due to the deceitfulness of his sources, there is no clear instance where in the Hellenica there is a direct assertion that is not true and that Xenophon must have known was not true. It seems safe to say that Xenophon did not tell outright lies. If we accept this principle, the consequences are important. Starting in Book 2, Chapter 3:11, Xenophon tells the story of the 30 tyrants from the time of their installation. According to his account, near the beginning of their rule, a Spartan garrison came to Athens. Then Critias arranged for the judicial murder of his rival Theramenes, and after that Thrasybulus. At this point, an exile from the 30 raised the standard of democracy as at the fortress of Philae in the Athenian countryside. But these events are placed in the reverse sequence by the Constitution of Athens, written later in the 4th century, within the school of the philosopher Aristotle. However, Xenophon surely would have remembered these harrowing events from his youth correctly. Major error here would have to be put down as lies on his part. Conversely, if we accept from his record elsewhere that he does not tell lies, he must be right here. And fortunately, other evidence bears this out. For instance, Diodorus Siculus in Book 14, chapters 4 through 6, and then again in Book 14, chapter 32, as well as the other Ephyran sources, support him, that is, support Xenophon on the main points after the 30 have come to power, although not on every detail. Since Ephorus was mostly following the Oxyrhynchus historian in these years, the Oxyrhynchus historian too probably placed these three events in the same order as did Xenophon. As for the author of the Aristotelian Constitution of Athens, although he has modern supporters on this and other historical points, he was a pedant, an armchair academic in a sense, with no sense of historical reality, and certainly liable to be duped by forged documents and propaganda shams. Furthermore, he was so biased in favor of moderate oligarchs that he fails to mention that their hero Theramenes was himself a member of the 30. Xenophon is not only the liveliest and most atmospheric historian of the 30, we can largely trust him on these events. However, while Xenophon does not tell outright lies, he can deliberately mislead. For example, in the way that he makes use of references to the destruction of the Long Walls in Athens in 404 to slide over the Spartans' second intervention there, specifically to force the 30 on the Athenians. Similarly, misleading is Hellenica, Book 3, Chapter 21, a famous chronological problem where Xenophon appears to synchronize at least some part of the Spartan Deraclides campaigns in Asia, 399 to 397, which he has just described, with at least some part of the Spartan war against Elis, which he goes on to describe. One would naturally infer that they either both started as at much the same time, or that he recounted Deraclides' campaigns first because they started first. But other implications of Xenophon's narrative virtually require that the Elean War broke out before Deraclides' venture to Asia. Furthermore, the slightest overlap between the Elean War and the Spartan campaigns is incomprehensible, or at least incompatible with what the learned biographer Plutarch had to say 500 years later about the length of the reign of King Agesilaus, who came to power after the Elean War had ended. A few scholars have thought that Xenophon is right and Plutarch is wrong. Most have supposed that Plutarch is right and Xenophon was simply careless or in error. But in fact, Xenophon is again being deliberately misleading, for he takes care only to imply that the synchronization exists. He implies the synchronization, and he does not assert it. Since at this point, what he writes is not a complete sentence. One can only speculate as to the reasons, but it seems a fair bet that there was something about the course of Spartan policy in these years that he wanted to obscure. It can be difficult to draw a line between deceitfulness and merely putting a spin on the facts. In Hellenica 4, chapter 4, 6, Xenophon apparently asserts that the Argives extinguished the independence of Corinth immediately after the Corinthian aristocrats were massacred in February of 392. However, it appears from the mention of Corinthian ambassadors at a peace congress in Sardis a little later, that is Book 4, chapter 813, that this is not so. And later still, there was another peace congress in Sparta, unmentioned by Xenophon, the fruits of which were unsuccessfully commended to the Athenians by the politician Andocides. And it seems from his speech that Corinth was then still a sovereign state. The truth seems to be, though, that in 392, Argos and Corinth entered into a close association, allowing the citizens of each state rights to own land and attend the assembly of the other state. It seems that the final move to full union came only in 390, around the time that Iphicrates is recorded as having shed pro-Argive Corinthian blood. A closer look at Book 4 of the Hellenica, chapter 4-6, shows that Xenophon uses verb forms there that are appropriate for a union in progress rather than one that is already consummated. So he was aware of the truth, but adopted the perspective of his Corinthian friend Passimilus, who doubtless thought that the arrangements of 392 were as good as extinguished the state of Corinth. Xenophon would presumably say that that was a legitimate interpretation of events. This same speech of Andocides, which still exists, reveals another piece of spin by Xenophon. According to Xenophon, Hellenica, Book 4, Chapter 8, 12 through 16, Athens had selfishly broken up the earlier Congress of Sardis after failing to obtain from it 3 particular islands in the Aegean. Again, from that speech of Andocides, we learn that the Congress of Sparta permitted Athens to retain the 3 islands, but the Athenians still rejected the peace terms. There is good evidence that they did so because the proposed agreement ceded the Greeks of Asia to continuing Persian control, a motive on Athens's part that does not seem so selfish. So can Xenophon escape the charge that he has suppressed the Congress of Sparta because of bias against Athens? Perhaps he would respond that he was making the legitimate point that the Athenians were indeed selfish throughout, not concerning themselves with the Greeks of Asia from disinterested motives, but only for what they could get out of them. We would still prefer him to have said so explicitly, however. Similarly, where Xenophon downplays successful Persian involvement in mainland Greek affairs in the years 376 to 366, he might make a case that the impetus for the peace agreements concluded in these years came from mainland Greece. He might argue that after 386, the Persians served merely as a rubber stamp, except in the unsuccessful intervention of 367 that he does narrate at length. That would be a thin excuse, even if true, and in fact it seems more likely that the Persians actively shaped the outcomes of these peace negotiations. But perhaps it brings Xenophon's omissions on this topic within the bounds of legitimate interpretation. It would be like his leaving out various events during Agesilaus's 395 campaign in Asia, by which he is not suggesting that these events did not occur, but rather implying that they were not important. Some of Xenophon's omissions are startling indeed. The liberation of Messenia, as we've said, the foundation, extent, and importance of the Second Athenian League, as we've also said, the Athenian War for Amphipolis, the capture of Samos and its aftermath, the foundation of Megalopolis, but he cannot have intended to deceive in these cases. Perhaps he did not hope to extinguish the memory of the Theban Peloponnesian victory at the Battle of Tegeira in the mid-370s. But in general, when he omitted such major events, he cannot have imagined that people would not know of them or that he could make readers forget they ever happened. He intended, rather, his audience to think of him as a historian, but not to assume he was providing a full chronicle. Most of the omissions that astonish us now must have seemed pretty odd to Xenophon's first audience. Presumably, he anticipated that reaction and even intended it as part of the literary effect. With what ingenuity, he might hope his friends would say approvingly. With what ingenuity does Xenophon avoid specifying Epaminondas's appalling actions in Messenia? And how fitting that the unspeakable should remain unspoken. It is not so much that these omissions undermine his trustworthiness, or that they raise doubts about his comprehension of his time, if the reading he presents fails to accommodate much of what seems obviously important to us. What about Xenophon's interpretation of the period that he narrates? To come to a judgment of Xenophon's interpretation of the events of his half-century is not an easy task. First, one has to make Xenophon's interpretation explicit. Then one has to develop one's own interpretation in order to set Xenophon's view against it. Both steps are fraught with problems. For example, some scholars praise Xenophon for showing that the Greek city-state system was bankrupt. In their view, constant internecine strife rendered Greece ripe for inevitable takeover by a power under the control of a single directing mind, like Macedon. But others um, take a different tack. They would say that this reading of Xenophon and this view of Greek history are dubious. Xenophon stresses the unexpected continuance of disorder in Greece because the Battle of Mantinea proved indecisive. Although this does not mean he despairs of order ever being achieved, for him, rather, the outcome is in the hands of the gods, whom he did not cease to think of as beneficent, although albeit inscrutable. Indeed, his main point here is more likely to be that since everything is still up for grabs, pro-Spartans need not despair of seeing the developments of the 360s reversed. But if he had concluded that Sparta, Athens, and Thebes were already doomed in 362 to come under some power of an external hegemon, he would have surely been wrong. Macedon's rise after 362 was by no means inevitable. There was no historical law compelling the Thebans, Athenians, and Spartans to make Philip's triumph easier by various and repeated errors of judgment. And there are two similar reasons why it would be inappropriate to praise Xenophon for hankering after the rule of a strong man. First, such a desire would have not been praiseworthy. Athens and Sparta both drew strength and stability from their collective institutions, which meant they were not dependent on the continued life and good fortune of any individual. Second, he is not arguing for autocracy or something close to it, in preference to the traditional constitutions of the Greek cities. If he has a message about autocrats in the Hellenica, it is that the wrath of the gods is liable to descend on them, bringing them to a sticky end. Historians who prefer to step deep into the explanations for things, to try to find deep causes for political and diplomatic change, will see Xenophon as superficial, when not superstitious, about the downfall of Sparta. Others, later in the 4th century, offered economic causes for the catastrophe. Ephorus and other scholars, both ancient and modern, argued that it was inevitable, and the inevitable result of a destabilizing and demoralizing influx of wealth at the end of the Peloponnesian War, a view advanced less frequently now than that it has become clear that the citizen body of 5th century Sparta already displayed significant inequalities of wealth. The philosopher Aristotle attributed Sparta's collapse to a growing shortage of manpower produced by her land tenure arrangements, and modern studies have shown that Sparta's land tenure arrangements and her citizenship rules would together lead to a fall in the number of Spartan citizens. But the suggested links between these factors and Sparta's loss of control over the Peloponnese in these years are not beyond doubt. Fewer citizens did not have to mean fewer soldiers, at least as potent may have been changes in military technique and avoidable errors in judgment, that is, in the type of cause that Xenophon writes about when he is not theologizing. However, this much, at least, must be said against Xenophon as a man of insight into his contemporary world. He failed to recognize that the Spartans could never recover Messenia. That was a key error in judgment, although perhaps hard for Spartans and their fellow travelers like Xenophon to avoid. The refusal to come to terms with the loss of Messenia prevented Sparta from reaching a stable accommodation with the other Peloponnesian states. That helped let Philip of Macedon into Greece, which Xenophon would surely have deplored. Still, had he lived, it would have been some consolation to him that Philip's success laid the groundwork for the Greeks at last to launch that great crusade against Persia and to triumph under Philip's son, Alexander the Great. Thank you.